I almost feel as though my channel to a certain point has been a series of videos where I somehow always find the excuse to say, I'm not an RPG guy, but this one is really good. I like this one. And a few too many videos later, I think I'm finally beginning to notice a pattern and realize I could have just been wrong in that estimation. This is probably a story you already know by now if you've known of me, but after falling head over heels in love with Xenoblade, yeah, I know, I promise, I'm only going to talk about it a little bit in this video. I finally got what about these games clicked with so many people. The immersive atmosphere of the world, the mountains of lore and in-universe mechanics to learn about, the satisfaction of character growth both in the story and in the combat, the often quirky cast of characters who are fun to experiment with, and the otherworldly music you could listen to for days straight and hardly get sick of it. Initially, I thought it was simply Xenoblade teaching me why RPGs worked in a way that specifically worked for me in this franchise, but now, I think I just get it. I still think that out of everything I've played, Xenoblade is still my favorite RPG franchise. The fusion of action elements with the standard RPG stuff and the consistently gripping narratives and the way they're told end up making me intensely invested in those games in ways that I just don't get with any other franchise in the same way. Xenoblade may have just been the gateway drug to every other substance JRPGs have been dealing for the past 40 years. The marijuana that escalated up to Final Fantasy's crystal meth, if you will. Get it? Like crystals, because these games have a lot of crystals in them. Isn't that a funny joke? If you want a full picture of what led us to this point, well, there's this video. And soon after uploading it, I started diving down the rabbit hole. If I was an RPG guy after all, then I had a lot of catching up to do. So, a Switch game or two and a Steam summer sale later, I have now played Your eyes do not deceive you. I'm talking about each and every one of these games, so I can piss off as many RPG fanbases as humanly possible by being wrong about all of them. We're not going to go particularly deep into each of these games, but I will talk about what stuck out to me in each one, what drew me to it, what kept me invested, my favorite parts, you know the drill. There will be spoilers and timestamps for all of these games. Each section will be almost entirely isolated, so I will only make extremely vague comparisons when referring to other games not included in a particular segment. I will also be borrowing some footage because I didn't want to diminish my experiences with these games by recording my entire first playthroughs and worrying about hard drive space the whole time, particularly in cases like Persona 4, which took me 90 hours to beat. So the editing may be a little bit less jumpy as I usually try to make it. It took me way too long to finally admit it to myself, but I think I'm an RPG guy after all. So let's prove definitively once and for all that I am absurdly and unquestionably wrong. This is the series that always made me so disappointed growing up because I loved so much about Pokemon, but I would never ever finish one of these games. The only exceptions were Pokemon Diamond, where I would never switch off of my Infernape and I close combated every single enemy in sight, and Soul Silver because my best friend was playing alongside me. That and I got my first shiny Pokemon during that playthrough, and that was pretty cool. I tried over and over and over again, and I only ever managed to finish those two games. I would just bounce off the rest of them after long enough. I had never played one of the GBA games, and I had heard many great things about this era of the series. And given that this is one of the biggest media franchises on the planet, it could be safely assumed that I would have a means of playing said beloved titles on the Nintendo Switch. Okay. Never mind, Nintendo or the Pokemon Company, whoever's in charge up there, they don't care. Well, surely I could just play on an authentic GBA then, right? I mean, there were tens of millions of them out there and millions of copies of Pokemon. Okay. Nope, we're not doing that. So, through the magic of legal acquisition, as well as playing on the intended hardware, I plunged into Pokemon Emerald and Pokemon White, and what do you know? What was initially an excuse to get footage became a relaxing background game to throw on while I was working on the Xenoblade 2 video and just allowed me to relax my hands for a few hours. I'm going to be unceremoniously conjoining my thoughts on both Pokemon Emerald and White into this one segment because I played these games back in January to April, so I'm a little fuzzy on some details, and my thoughts on certain aspects of these games tend to overlap. Now that I understood what the appeal of leveling systems was, I instantly grabbed onto the thrill of being a kid with my own band of Pokemon. The way you can tailor your team compositions to make your own little family of freaks has always been and probably always will be the best part of Pokemon. Even when my dumbass didn't bother learning beyond the very basics of the combat system, the Pokemon designs have always been the thing that draw me into the world of Pokemon. They're so vibrant and unique from each other. They offer so much lore through their designs as well. There are obviously less inspired designs in each generation, but I sincerely don't notice a disparity between generations on that front. Part of me feels like that's just kind of the way it has to be when you're adding another 70 to 100 unique designs in a series with over 900 previous designs or concepts that can rarely be reused in the same way. I love how intimately entrenched in nature Hoenn is. I know. Too much water! But Hoenn in particular feels so alive because of how much emphasis is placed on the landmarks throughout your journey. I especially love how Wally explores that connection to nature via his allergies. It's more than just set dressing, it has a visible effect on the characters around you. You go through your standard caves, grassy plains, lakes and whatnot, but you climb to the top of a damn volcano, you dive to the deepest depths of the sea, you essentially conquer the world by capturing Groudon and or Kyogre. As ridiculous as it sounds coming from someone who spends way too much time indoors playing video games, nature has always been just so relaxing to me. There's this unspoken serenity to it I've grown to appreciate significantly with age. You'll never catch me living in a city if I can help it. Too many damn noises, traffic, and people everywhere. But something like this? Hell yeah, I can get behind this. Unova initially didn't strike me as relaxing a region as Hoenn was, but the variety of cities and locales waiting for me proved to surpass Gen 3's atmosphere. K-Jewelers made this amazing video on Generation 5's season mechanic and the various other little flourishes that bring the ambiance to new heights for the series if you're interested in a really detailed discussion into that. Pokemon music has always been just like, alright in my book, but I rarely ever listen to the soundtracks outside of the games. Until Black and White, because god damn dude, there are bangers around every corner in this game. Guys, I'm pretty sure the credits are supposed to help the adventure wind down. You're not supposed to zap it back up. What is this shit? Accumulatown has always been one of my favorites in the franchise, partially because I didn't get much farther than this when I was younger, but the point still stands that this theme is bouncy with a capital B and is one of my favorite town themes in gaming. Pokemon White's story was actually interesting too, so that was a plus. Emeralds didn't really grab me that much, but it was particularly cool to be up against two enemy organizations instead of just one. That three-way conflict did a lot to make the goals of Team Magma and Aqua respectively feel at least a little varied, even if it was ultimately just the same desire for world conquest thing, just using land or water. Pokemon White, however, was actually interesting. For one thing, Team Plasma's supposed goal for the overarching majority of the game felt reasonably believable. Most Pokemon villains seem almost cartoonishly evil and follow the idea that Pokemon exist to serve humans or whatever, and eventually Ghetsis ends up being similarly vain, but Plasma and N particularly, fighting for Pokemon liberation seemed like a cause you could actually convince real human beings into advocating for. Obviously, the means by which Plasma does this is wrong, they are the villains, but N having been hoodwinked by Ghetsis to feed his own power makes you feel bad for the guy who's essentially just been an obstacle to your progress for the whole game. N just wanted to do the right thing and Ghetsis used that will of his to trick him. It's hard to feel anything but pity for him in that sense, and that's the most complex emotional journey I've ever seen a Pokemon rival have. That was the other thing too, the friend characters Bianca and Cheren likewise felt fleshed out in a way that none of the other rivals or friend characters felt in the other games. Cheren fights like hell to prove that he's better than you and that this is his story, but after meeting Alder, he begins to question how important being the best at something really is. By the time you reach Victory Road, he and Bianca find solace in the fact that they aren't following the same path as you, but it doesn't make them less valuable as people. We're not all meant to be or achieve the same thing, and sometimes the only way we can really learn that and truly understand it is to try and fail at something. It's not an easy journey to get through, but these two, again, demonstrated a level of mature growth that at the start of the game I never would have expected based on my previous adventures through this series. Then there was stuff like the motif of truth and ideals conflicting with one another via the legendary dragons and the way that's visually represented reaching a middle ground in the Opelucid City gym. God, I just wish the story was fresher in my memory because there's no doubt a mountain of things that I'm forgetting. Again, please watch this video. It does an amazing job encapsulating the whole experience. Random encounters have always irritated me, and they probably always will to some extent, but my GBA and DS actually came with this weird little mod on it. I don't even know how the guy installed it, but whenever I held this newly installed ZL button, I could just speed up the game, and it made the process of grinding for levels more relaxing than it was tedious. That was the thing about Pokemon that really grabbed me this time around. From what I've seen, these games have always been criticized for being easy and samey, both of which I think are valid criticisms, but after jumping from a bunch of games that are essentially shouting, "End this war! Save the future! Kill God! Kill God!" to have a wholesome time traveling the world with your animal buddies, it made it so much easier to just meet the game on its own terms and just relax. I kind of just vibed out with the sights and sounds of the game and let the grind inveigle me into the ridiculously addictive gameplay loop of leveling and evolving your Pokemon. The party building in Pokemon has always been its strongest asset, and it's really no wonder why. Not only does the fairly lenient difficulty in the main stories allow for any Pokemon to be viable with enough patience and strategy, but it makes it so much more appealing to assemble teams with the designs that resonate with you the most. It helps in Gen 5's case that there was this rustling grass mechanic that would often direct you towards Pokemon who would give you a greater experience yield. It's such a small thing, but giving the player a means of engaging a wild Pokemon yourself instead of the game doing it to you is oddly empowering in such a simple way, and that experience boost is a delicious cherry on top. Gen 5 also finally put the Pokemart inside the Poke Centers, and now everything is just condensed into one building. The more I go into Generation 5, the more I genuinely have a harder time understanding how it was ever considered a divisive entry. It has so many little great additions like these. I understand that waiting for the post-game to re-encounter your old favorite Pokemon could be a turnoff, but I don't think that's a lot to ask personally. Then again, I'm usually comfortable experimenting in games like this, so it wasn't gonna bother me anyway. Since team building is such a large part of the experience, I wanted to highlight my crew for these two games because, I don't know, it sounded like fun. It's my video, what are you gonna do to stop me? The Pokemon I rolled through Emerald with were as follows. KFC, who was my starter, and while the name may be a little bit cruel, so is he. Fierce attacker, quick on the draw, has a wide type coverage across his 4 moves. Meanwhile, on the complete opposite end of the globe in just about every single way is Scrotal Lozenge for dedicated special attack and defense, plus psychic type moves have always been a big plus for me. Jake kind of gave up on the name, but seeing as he's a dual type of flying and grass, he provided excellent coverage and a solid excuse to always have fast travel readily accessible. Sadie, who definitely doesn't remind me of anyone I know in real life, has solid physical stats and an out-of-pocket Shadow Ball equipped, and isn't weak to many elements. Turters, who originally bore resemblance to someone related to the legendary Zeke von Genbu chaotic bringer of chaos, but now has hit puberty a couple of times. What he is now is a ground dragon type with solid all-around stats and some dragon type moves to help humble some of the monsters that awaited us in the Elite Four. Finally, Lochad, one of my favorite Pokemon designs in the entire series. He has well-rounded stats, absorbs HP in the rain, learns solid grass and water type moves, the total package. Together we did encounter hardship, particularly with this dickhead Kingdra in Drake's Elite Four battle, but with the power of perseverance and the convenience of that weird little ZL mod I was talking about, we beat Drake and Scrotal Lozenge came in with the shockwave of the century on Wallace's Gyarados and brought us into the Pokemon Hall of Fame. In Pokemon White, my team had a lot of utility throughout the whole adventure, but during the last battles I ended up leaning on my starter pretty heavily for tanking. I may have just been under-leveled too, but I'm not so sure, because I remember beating the Elite Four pretty easily, but whatever. The aforementioned starter was Drippy. Not much to say about her, just a cute Pokemon who grew into something fierce. Useful water moves and such, yeah. Crabbleman is basically a Crabble in Xenoblade, but instead of wearing Mechon armor, it has rock armor. She sounds like nothing special, but this is actually the first bug-type Pokemon I've ever seriously used in a playthrough of one of these games, and the unique dual typing was a major reason why. Baddington is a speedy boy who is pretty fragile, but he certainly came through a number of times. Valerie took a little bit of work to get set up the way I wanted her to be, but once she got Hyper Voice, it was the most fun I've ever had using a normal type Pokemon. LOL is your standard attacker with a cool-ass design. Yeah, he just carries his girder around like it's nothing. He's cool like that. Last but absolutely not least is Larbunkle, a fluffy teddy bear on the outside, but he sure loves to raise hail when he's out and about. Get it? Hail? Like from ice? We sure had a bumpy ride, but I loved each of these guys all the same, and I loved Pokemon White from start to finish. To call me late to the party on this one would require a redefinition of the word entirely, but it was just so nice to finally wholeheartedly enjoy Pokemon. For a while it felt like this unresolved thing in the back of my head, like there just had to be something I wasn't getting. It never feels good to not enjoy something that basically everyone else on planet Earth loves, and for a while I had trouble accepting that maybe I just didn't love Pokemon after all. I think this is why Xenoblade introducing to me the appeal of leveling systems, the importance of world building, and the atmospheric presence of RPGs to me in a more action-oriented way was just so helpful in helping me understand these games. Because Pokemon was never lacking in those things, it's just that at the time I was picking up the series, the only thing I had the patience for was action, action, action all the time, as if that's all that games are meant to be. Once I got a little more patient and more willing to lose time in a fictional world, it made me get all of it. Not just why it works for people, but why it previously didn't work for me. And so, while from the outside looking in, it's just me liking this series of games that everyone else already did, to me it means something so much more. Generation 5 in particular will likely become one of my favorite games on revisits, I think, and I certainly don't object to exploring more of this expansive series. I feel as though the story very well could have ended there. Evidently, though, it didn't. If I managed to turn myself around on Pokemon, well, there was no excuse to shelter myself from the rest of what I could experience in this genre. And so, through the foggy, unknown horizon of JRPGs, there was only one that could help me reach out to the truth. Persona has always existed in my mind as a sort of modern JRPG. I saw a lot of people talk up Persona 5 for years. It seems so modern, and it got a lot of people who don't like RPGs typically to care about them, and so it was really surprising to me to actually find out how long Persona and Shin Megami Tensei have actually been around for. After seeing so many people experience something similar to what I experienced with Xenoblade Chronicles 2, Persona 5 was the game that I yearned to play, but there was a small problem. I never really got around to getting a PlayStation 4, and the only game I would really get one for now is Bloodborne, and as interested as I am in that game, I can't say I'm that interested. I'm still laughing hysterically at how badly Sony's supplying retailers with the PlayStation 5, and so Persona 4 coming to Steam and Liam Triforce's excellent analysis on Persona 3, 4, and 5 made for a great catalyst to start my proper journey with this franchise. I didn't get as hooked on this game as I did Xenoblade, but there was something special there that grabbed me, and it never quite loosened its grip. Persona 4 didn't have the sweeping spectacle areas and engagingly detailed fantasy world that Xenoblade proudly flaunts, but something much more intimate, more personal. Get it? Persona... I'm genuinely so sorry. Inaba is a fantastic hub world to acquaint yourself with throughout the game. It perfectly emulates that small suburban hometown ambiance. You've got your usual hangout spots like the hallways after class, the shopping district, and Okina City, but you've also got some areas to just take in the serenity of nature surrounding you. Since one half of this game is spent in ethereal and LSD-flavored hallways with nightmare-fuel monsters, it makes your connection to Inaba so much stronger when you're past all of that and you're back in your safe haven. You're alright now, man, just take it easy. Read a book when you get home, or maybe just go fishing if it'll take the edge off, man. You've earned it. It's easy to see how Inaba feels like something of a video game's second home to many people, because proportional to the amount of time you spend in dungeons, you walk around it about as often as you would your real hometown after work or school. It's pretty hard to detach from that feeling when you're so frequently greeted by this absurdly iconic theme. I think Persona 4 does an amazing job of making you find an excuse to appreciate some of the tedious things you end up doing in your day-to-day life, especially during childhood. Because Inaba feels so homey and nostalgic, it brings you right back to the times when the most difficult thing was getting your friends to convince their parents to let them hang out with you, or when just walking around and being in the world felt inviting and carefree. It's funny because despite being thrust into this insane shadow world where nothing makes sense, the intense struggles that the characters often grapple with are studying for their next exam or growing up and discovering who they're gonna be. Fighting shadow demons? I mean, yeah, I guess it can be kind of tough, but dealing with bullies and discovering who you are? Whew! What is that? Oh, my bad. That's just imposter syndrome. Fuck. It did not take long for this eclectic group of dorks to grow on me. I certainly have misgivings with the way some characters are handled, particularly Yosuke in the main plot evolving from an intelligent driving force behind wanting to solve the mystery to a kind of homophobic horn dog for a few of the slice of life portions of the game. In fact, all of the male characters throw their minds into the horn dog gutter for notable segments of the game. People dog on Xenoblade 2 for its fan service, and that's valid, but I've frequently seen people point to Persona by comparison as a series that treats it correctly, and after playing 4 and from what I have seen of 5, 2 of the most popular entries, I really couldn't disagree more. I'm not trying to tell you that Xenoblade 2 did it right or anything, but at least there weren't multiple entire sections of that game taken up by the characters doing things entirely unrelated to the main plot for the sake of comedy, I suppose? Teddy has a really poignant arc about discovering how he's actually a shadow and attempting to discover how to fit into the human world where he wants to belong. Eventually he decides that he wants to protect the shadow world at the end of the game, and that's a beautiful journey of discovery for him to take. It brings him to a lot of emotional places. I wish his personality after gaining a human form wasn't almost entirely, oh man, I can't wait to somehow shift any conversation into a way I can somehow try to get a girl to like me.
Come on, baby. Don't fight over me.
Ew! I adore Kanji. He's the best character in the game, and you cannot fight me on that. But even he gets like this too during the beauty pageant, and it's just so fucking lame. Yosuke makes me feel more conflicted than he should because he's an overwhelmingly likable character for the majority of the game, but some of the stuff he says to Kanji can be really awful. The camping trip after the cooking segment just nosedives Yosuke into the Earth's mantle. I understand that a lot of this comes from him disliking himself and being insecure, and Lord knows that many kids that age, including myself during that period in my life, aren't above making hurtful remarks akin to this, perhaps ignorant of the implications, but that still doesn't mean someone has to like it or be cool with it because it informs his character flaws. Now, this is all coming from a Westerner's perspective, and I'm unsure how this is all viewed from an Eastern lens. I don't have any doubt this could be a realistic experience for kids figuring out who they are and who may be othered or targets for bullying in Eastern countries, but regardless, I find it's the single most dated thing about the game that otherwise has brilliant and innovative takes on the RPG side of the game. With all of that said, watching these flawed characters all take their personal journeys to discover who they want to be thanks to your help really was a treat. One of my favorite things about this game is how every main party member is introduced to you by putting their biggest problems at the forefront of the dungeons. As time goes on, I begin to realize more and more that characters are compelling to us because of their flaws, their struggles, and their insecurities. Having witty dialogue or charming personalities is certainly a plus, but we connect to these characters the more that we can see ourselves in them. Knowing what they're going through significantly elevates your empathy for them as people and not as a role in a script. So seeing this game come right out of the gate saying this is what this person struggles with before getting to know them more intimately via the social links was a subversive way of obtaining new party members that I really liked. Social links are an absolutely brilliant mechanic. It's as if heart-to-hearts in Xenoblade were one half of the game. I know, it's truly shocking, but this was easily my favorite part of the game. They're an incredibly seamless way to bridge the dungeon crawling half and the social simulator half of this game together, or at least as much as you could make transitioning from this to this seamless. When you're done with whatever given school event is happening in the story, you're given the choice to spend your afternoon however you want. You can go somewhere to raise your social stats like the library to raise your knowledge, you can get yourself a part-time job to earn some yen whilst getting closer to characters outside of your normal social circle, you can go to hell, and you can most importantly, grow closer to your party members and help them surpass whatever obstacles are in their way from accepting their true selves. Every social link character in the game gets 10 unique scenes of them developing who they are or solving a problem, and each time you experience one of them, that social link will level up. What this does is grant you more experience when fusing a persona of the same arcana, and in the case of party members, grants increases in stats and new abilities for combat. These abilities aren't necessarily limited to just new spells or increased healing proficiency, they can also reinforce your connection to that party member because they'll be more likely to help you stand back up, break you out of a status effect, or even take a fatal blow for you. I cannot overstate how much I adore this and how it bridges these two diametrically opposed halves of this game together. It's not an exaggeration to say that in order to become a stronger fighter, you have to grow closer to the people around you. You have to help these kids figure out who they are and give them a shoulder to lean on. By taking the time to help a friend or a coworker, you're leveling up in the shadow world. Sure, it's not as cool as fighting shadow demons, but considering how everything that you do outside of that can be applied to enhancing your capability to fight, in a sense, nothing that you do is a waste of time, or at least not many things. You can't just kind of fuck around eating beef bowls forever, which is objectively funny. This makes it so that one way or another, you're gonna have to go out of your way to connect with this cast as much as you can. You all know that I would have done this anyway, even if it wasn't incentivized, but it's not an exaggeration to say that you're kneecapping yourself a pretty fair bit if you're not trying to develop these goofballs as much as possible. It's pretty damn easy to adore this main party as a result, despite some of the flaws that can get in the way of me doing so at times. Yosuke's definitely not a perfect guy, but damn if he isn't a true-to-life exploration of a lot of issues that teenage boys go through. He manages to be so incredibly likable for a vast majority of the game, and I think a lot of that has to do with Yuri Lowenthal's voice acting. I think he was the best voiced character in the game, and he talks a lot, so it's a damn good thing that's the case. Yosuke's made out to be public enemy number 2 by association with his family who runs Juness, a shopping mall that's thinning out the shopping district and putting a lot of family-owned businesses out of order. Yeah, capitalism, everybody. Worse yet, he yearns to be seen as special by someone who can wholeheartedly accept him and see him for who he is and not as the Juness kid. He dreads the thought of being alone, and that became a very prominent reality for him when he was moved from the city into the small town of Inaba. Considering how much work he's had thrust upon him by Juness's employees and his father, and how he's expected to be able to just handle all of it, I think the game is implying a sense of some amount of toxic masculine traits being enforced on him, specifically through dialogue choices like be a man, stand up straight, when he's emotionally expressing himself coming to terms with his fucking friend's death. That and how his final social link conversation with you involves the two of you beating the shit out of each other to stop feeling emotional. It's not hard to understand why Inaba, by association, represented a lot of what's gone wrong in his life, causing him to resent it a fair bit. If he isn't allowed to express his emotions in a healthy way, it all boils up into a ball of resentment at the world around him. It was absurdly heartwarming to eventually see him reach the conclusion that whether he's in the city or not doesn't matter. It's the people who surround him that make him feel at home. It could be Inaba or anywhere, and as long as these guys are there with him, it's home. Kanji has grown to accept that maybe he's the type who never gets interested in girls, but that doesn't mean that the world around him has accepted him. You see him constantly get targeted by law enforcers and put into uncomfortable confrontations because of his reputation and the fact that most people wouldn't look at him with the assumption that he's the teddy bear that he is. He loves to knit stuffed animals, he adores cute things, and the only reason that he caused all the trouble that he did was for his mother's sake, because she had trouble sleeping at night with all the noise outside. Anyone who takes the time to actually get to know Kanji knows that he has a heart of liquid gold, and seeing him grow to accept himself wholeheartedly after the kid and you do the same fills me with such a fuzzy, warm feeling inside. I don't want to rattle off all the party members because we'd be here forever, but those two were easily my favorite social links to follow, and the others were of comparable quality. The only notable problem that this system introduces is that it's kind of impossible to write a story that maintains the character growth that the parties go through in the social links within the main narrative. You aren't required to focus on any one specific social link other than the Mystery Gang and Teddy, which just happens alongside the main story. Everyone else can become completely static if you really don't want to engage with them. This has a somewhat jarring effect where one character can give you their manifesto and pour their heart out to you, and then immediately jump back into the story doing whatever goofy hijinks the story has lined up next. It can be especially jarring in the case of Dojima, where he realizes that he needs to protect you and give Nanako more of his attention instead of fixating so much on finding the person who killed his wife. And then the social link ends with him being like, yeah, anyways, watch Nanako while I'm gone. And then the story just continues like it was going anyway. It's not a major problem, it's just something that can snap you out of your immersion for a brief moment. Hey, I know I warned about spoilers earlier, but I'm about to reveal the final culprit of the game in this next section. And because this game is an insanely long mystery game, I just felt it was very important that I warn you. So if you haven't finished the game yet, please jump to another game's section, because it's going to be spoiler city from here on out. I love basically every character in the cast. Nanako and Dojima especially had excellent social link journeys. I loved following every bit as much as I did the main parties because of how tragic their lives are, especially Nanako's. The Heaven Dungeon in the arc of the game where she was in danger was by far the best part of the game and the most invested I got in the story. The ripple effect it has on every character and the dramatic shift in tone made the game feel like it was hitting its stride and putting all of its very best qualities at the forefront. The argument the party had about throwing Namatame into the TV world was wonderfully dark, but not by any means an unbelievable conversation for these characters to have. With how personally Yosuke especially has been affected by Namatame, it follows that he's the biggest advocate for pushing him in and doesn't blame the rest of the party if they don't want to take part in it. I can't say I'm fond of how in order to continue playing the game, you need to pick 7 specific dialogue options or you're going to get a bad ending, even if said choices do a comparable job de-escalating the situation, but I digress. I loved the moment when the party got Adachi to slip up and the game goes dead fucking silent.
What? That's ridiculous! We already know Namatame's the one who put them all in!
What did you just say?
Put them all in. Do you know something about the method behind their murders?
What do you say to that, Detective Adachi?
I don't know. I said I'm busy!
Wait, you son of a bitch!
I feel like the game easily could have ended after Adachi's fight, and it would have been the perfect way to end the game, and that's where I have to say I think the game's pacing falters the most in my opinion. I loved Marie's dungeon and arc, but the realization that the gas station attendant was actually Izanami all along felt like the game was just kind of dragging itself out for another dungeon. The game feels like it's kind of just going full, well, I brought my dinosaur who eats force field dogs mode. That said, this shit is one of the coolest killing blows I have ever seen. The only major gripe I have with the gameplay side of this game is practically a given, but the procedurally generated dungeons really aren't doing anything for me. Part of the appeal of video games for me as an adult is thinking about the thought process that could have gone into any given decision made by the development team. It could be for anything, soundtrack choice, character designs, but by far the one that I love analyzing the most is level design. Thinking about how you design an area to be intuitive to navigate or how to make a puzzle not be cryptic has always been really interesting to me. Like, there's a language a game has to teach you subconsciously so that the game can make you feel like you're the genius figuring these things out or discovering these landmarks for yourself. In reality, the work of genius is thinking a step ahead and interpreting the infinite possibilities players could approach the game from and working around it in such a way that they won't get lost or baffled in confusion. When things are procedurally generated like this, sure, it can work. Roguelike is the genre that primarily comes to mind there, but in dungeons where you're meant to be exploring unique locales, it feels lame. Outside of a select few floors staged specifically for cutscenes or some oddball gimmicks, it doesn't feel like you're really plunging into a deeper, infinitely expanding shadow world, but a collection of hallways with some bad guys and some treasure chests waiting for you so you aren't just walking. Instead of looking at each room thinking, I wonder what the level designers were trying to do with this room, what challenges is it presenting me, I'm instead thinking, I wonder what the level designers were thinking when making an algorithm to generate floors that have minimal personality or flavor. The conflicting thing here is that it makes it so that each trip you make into a dungeon can still grant you items from chests without being the exact same thing you did last time, but it also means that you can snap the game's difficulty in half by going back to a previous floor, looting, and then running back up until you get enough items or experience. This point is fairly moot as Persona 5's palaces aren't procedurally generated, and basically every time I hear someone bring them up, it is usually an excuse to praise them, so I think Atlas clearly got the message there. I absolutely loved those devilish golden hands though. These enemies grant you an absurdly high EXP and yen payout in return for having no weaknesses and being tanky and loving to flee from battle when it's most convenient for them, requiring you to make a risk-reward decision to go all in on physical moves and critical hits or to wait for them to flee. Defeating one of these bastards was intensely rewarding and was by far my favorite part of the non-boss floor dungeon experience. To me, you're never going to separate Persona from its stylistic visuals after how many conversations 5 sparked up, and 4 certainly wasn't as ridiculously vibrant as 5 is, but sonically and visually, I really haven't experienced anything quite like it in any of the other games mentioned in this video. The menus were a little confusing for me to navigate at first, but eventually I just grew to love the sound effect when you're scrolling through the list. It's so simple yet so absurdly pleasing. The soundtrack is unrelentingly upbeat in a way that defined Inaba as such a welcoming locale for the whole journey without once being obnoxious, which is a feat in its own right if you ask me. An incredibly varied album featuring J-pop, funk, disco, and EDM that made even the repetitive hallways more than palatable because you're listening to this! I don't know how to put this, but the drums and percussion in particular have a really strong kick to them that made me immediately latch on to I'll Face Myself whenever it was time for a new member of the party to hop aboard. Despite this, the game knows when to get quiet, and so when it rains and the victims are in danger, the town isn't defined by its sound, but by its lack of it. This soundtrack quickly became one of my all-time favorites. It's a great selection to listen to for motivation when writing. It's actually how I wrote most of this video despite having writer's block for most of it actually. With that, I think that's all I got on Persona 4, for now anyway. I'm absurdly happy that I played it, and the hype that I built up for all that time was certainly worth it, and there's no way I'm missing Persona 5 on PC now. The characters will always exist somewhere in my head, the music is never going to leave any of my playlists, and the emotional journey the game took me on through its story is something I don't think I'll soon forget. This game really was something special, and that a game like it was so ahead of its time in so many ways in 2008 is an accomplishment. So what if I told you there existed a game that was very much the same way, but even older? Well, my friends, that game's name is Chrono Trigger. When we talk about the greatest games ever made, the Super Nintendo is a console that occupies many an entry on that extensive wall of fame. 2D game design was hitting something of an apex, and developers were going sicko mode, making classic after classic like the Donkey Kong Country games, Super Mario World, A Link to the Past, Super Metroid, Earthbound, Secret and Trials of Mana, Final Fantasies 4 through 6. Do I even need to continue? I could do this all day. However, I don't think any of these games have withstood the abrasion of time quite as resolutely as Chrono Trigger has. If you obscured the year this game came out from the files, you could have easily convinced everyone that this game came out a few years ago alongside releases like Octopath Traveler or Xenoblade Chronicles 2. I think it is the best aged game I have ever played. If it wasn't self-evident, it didn't take very long for me to appreciate how truly ahead of its time this game was. How fitting for a game about time travel, right? I want to briefly mention that the order in which I chose to cover each of these games doesn't exactly align with the order I played them in. For instance, I played Final Fantasy IX before I got more than 3 hours into this game. It sounds irrelevant, and I bring it up specifically because it was insane playing this game, with the mindset of, oh, well, it's an older game, I should be prepared to give it some benefit of the doubt, only to find that it was oddly more ahead of the curve than some later Square Enix developed games. I don't want to dog on any of these games that I'm covering in this video, but it was almost baffling playing Chrono Trigger and seeing these more modern games use these more antiquated systems that this game improved in goddamn 1995. It's especially jarring to see in games that Square Enix developed afterward. Final Fantasy IX came out in 2000 and has random encounters, making the idea of exploring the overworld on foot completely unviable. The game requires you to go somewhere or talk to someone in order to switch party members, which is incredibly inconvenient. The battles can be so damn slow to start up at times, and certain animations can take 5 ever. Lastly, and most irritating of all, out-of-party characters do not earn any experience, meaning that if you enjoy experimenting with your party compositions like I do, you'll frequently need to grind unless you want some of the party members to fall behind for potentially the remainder of the game. This last one especially bothers me because this makes the games that do this feel like they're almost discouraging you from wanting to play around with each party member, which is obviously not the intention if they're giving you the option to use so many of them in the first place. Take Persona 4 Golden. It doesn't have random encounters, but it does require that you leave a dungeon in order to swap party members, and out-of-party characters don't earn any experience, again, necessitating grinding to ensure that each party member can remain viable. Unless you stick with a single party for the entire game, you're eventually going to reach a point where trying to distribute the experience equally on your own will lead to you falling behind in levels, leading to you just defeating more of the same goons, which is where grinding runs the risk of going from being relaxing to becoming tedious. Guys, it's okay to copy someone else's homework if it'll lead to more convenience, especially if it's your own damn homework. All of this is to say that I think Chrono Trigger has the perfect idea of how to incentivize experimentation via the experience distribution by giving out-of-party characters 75% of the EXP that the controlled characters get. This makes it so that if you want to balance everyone's levels out, you can comfortably do so without putting too much thought into it, seeing as everyone's getting the necessary experience to remain viable if you ever want to switch someone out. But the TP system and team tech attacks give you a reason to want to try and use different pairings to learn new attacks and spells. I cannot describe to you how happy I was seeing that this is the way leveling up worked in this game, and that I could just switch characters from the menu without any hassle whatsoever. That aforementioned experience balancing issue I often run into in RPGs never developed in this game, and I never had to think about it, which is quite frankly how I prefer it. Immersion is the name of the game in RPGs especially, and stuff like this only makes it easier for time to evaporate in front of you when you don't have to place any concentration on working around antiquated experience systems. Moreover, I loved fighting enemies in this game, seeing as battles were almost always telegraphed, and outside of the Lost Sanctum questline, it never felt frustrating to run into more goons because it was never random. I think one of the biggest unspoken reasons random encounters serve to irritate so many people, beyond simple impatience, is that they make it feel as though every resulting battle is almost insignificant. Outside of a select few memorable encounters like running into a cactuar for the first time in Final Fantasy, or that one fight that had you biting your nails right before you reached the ever-elusive save point, at times it can almost feel like every non-story encounter is almost not meant to happen. The tiling and backgrounds are often the same, the enemy types and variation are the same, and at a certain point it doesn't provide a consistent challenge as much as it provides funnels for EXP. Like in a Mario game, you aren't looking at every Goomba with the same trepidation you may have had when seeing it for the first time, you're just like, oh, it's another Goomba, and not thinking about much of anything after seeing it every subsequent time. That's just kind of how growth works in video games. Chrono Trigger simply providing trigger points for battles makes it feel like you're getting properly ambushed, and it provides some amount of visual flavor and enemy variation, seeing as you'll regularly run into new enemy types that blend together to provide unique challenges. For instance, in the Ocean Palace, you're running into scouters left and right, and initially you're running into single variants in groups. You'll run into a collection of blue scouters, so you can safely utilize multi-enemy ice or water magic, and you'll be exploiting their weaknesses perfectly. You can do the same for yellow and red scouters, who are weak to lightning and fire magic respectively, but it is not anywhere near that simple when you reach the elevator. Do you want to see what happens when you employ that same strategy in this situation?
Surprise, motherfucker!
Oh my god!
This is what happens if you aren't thinking on your feet in this game, and I will gladly take an occasionally intimidating but memorable set piece like this over randomly running into goons any day of the week. As a result of this approach to enemy encounters, it felt like the game had the perfect control over the level scaling and difficulty curve because the amount of experience someone has to go through is much easier to gauge since you've had to program in specific spots to trigger battles and can accordingly telegraph the right values to give the bosses. Aside from the Golem sisters, seriously, fuck these jackasses. Sleep has never once been useful to me at any point in the game, and now it's suddenly the only reasonable way to... Anyway, every single boss felt like a real challenge, but never once did the solution to them point back to you doing mindless busy work to make big numbers get bigger. Don't get me wrong, I've grown to significantly enjoy big number get bigger with more RPGs under my belt, but again, I would way sooner take this game's approach any day of the week. I must have died against Giga Gaia like 6 times, the same thing with Magus and a number of other boss fights, but all of these fights filled me with elation upon figuring them out without turning back. The Giga Gaia's arms are the real trouble, so it's best to take out one of them really fast before they get too many double hand attacks off on you, and then zero in on his head. It sounds simple, but you have to be managing your healing spells effectively as well, and in the active time battle system, it's not by any means a straightforward juggling act to keep going, especially not if someone faints. The same thing is true for the final phase of Lavos' core. You've got to defeat the right pod because it'll infinitely revive the left pod, which heals Lavos' humanoid form in the middle. The only way to do effective damage to the right one is to defeat the left one so its defenses will drop going into revival mode, and once it does so, you can go all in with your hardest hitting techs available. Sitting here and explaining it can only convey the tension I felt throughout the boss battle so much. I died to so many bosses in this game, and yet this is the one where I properly managed to figure out the optimal strategy on my first attempt. Needless to say, it felt really good to have done so. To put it simply, this feels like a series of battles built more around problem solving than it was around a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet of stats. While on the topic of tedium, I was greatly surprised to be met with the understanding that my choices actually made a difference in the story, even if they were often minor. The trend that I tend to find the most perplexing in many AAA modern games is how many story-driven games almost seem to relish the idea that you are going to experience exactly what the game wants you to experience, and that's that. You're not going to change that. A sentiment I've noticed has become more widespread in response is that people want games to respond to their choices, or just to give them meaningful choices in the first place. It may sound, and probably is, almost needy, but I think that's the kind of thing people desperately crave in games. It can kind of be a bummer to realize that you need to relinquish your player agency to the game for the best experience. I'm not trying to say that games that do this are lesser for that. Every game is built with a specific set of goals in mind, and that can vary in every possible way you can think of. It's not as simple as put this thing in your game and people will like it. However, I think there's a very good reason why games like Undertale, Witcher 3, and Breath of the Wild, allowing you to change the course of significant portions of your playthrough by making a choice, have become so popular. Again, not to imply any horseshit like linear games are lesser or anything, but can you remember the last time a game genuinely surprised you by responding to your actions like they're actually important to the experience you're having? Wasn't it uniquely pleasing? Maybe even freeing? All of this was to say that Chrono Trigger immediately makes it apparent that the world around you will be altered by your choices, and the game proves that they don't necessarily have to be irreversible and reality-shifting choices to be rewarding. It's hard to imagine a scenario where you don't get the rug pulled out from under you experiencing the court sequence for the first time. The game actually took notes on how you approached Marl for the first time, or how you taking that guy's lunch that his wife made special for him to keep fighting the robot dummy was not some harmless restore point. You ruined that guy's day, you villain! Go directly to jail. It doesn't dramatically alter the course of the story or anything, but the game takes no time to establish the idea that seemingly insignificant choices can make a difference. Eventually though, you can make two pretty huge choices that will significantly alter what end you get. Chrono makes a last stand against Lavos and dies in front of the party, and you can complete the game without ever trying to get him back. I unfortunately spoiled this for myself like a ditz, but knowing that I could save him, as in me, I can choose whether or not I save him and the game will adapt accordingly, was incredible. He's the damn main character, and you can just choose to let him be permanently dead. When is the last time you've had an RPG grant you an option as consequential as that? The second of the two big choices is that you can choose to fight off Magus after confronting him, or allow him to join your party. I know it's not by any means unheard of for JRPGs to have former villains join your party, but something about Magus being here really was just like insane to me, because he seemed to be Lavos' second in command, judging by how massive of an obstacle he was to you that far into the game. I was already privy to the idea that each member of the party was linked to one of the time periods you can travel to, and understanding that Shala was Magus' sister and that he was actually from the Antiquity period and attempting to summon Lavos to avenge his home was such a genuine shock to me. Again, seriously, 1995? And we're positive this is accurate, everyone. We're all sure about that? The real highlight of the game in terms of player choice for me, however, was a quest about planting things. Fiona is a woman in the Middle Ages with a strong affinity towards nature, and she wants to plant a forest around her place. The problem is, this sunken desert has unceremoniously sprung about thanks to this Melfix fella, so you gotta go beat his ass. So you do, but Fiona doesn't do anything yet. I thought she'd just get to planting right away as you'd expect in any other quest where you take care of one major objective and then you're just done. But then she says she needs someone who could tend to the forest for hundreds of years. And this kind of stumped me for a minute. My first thought was that I needed to talk to some NPCs to gather a community of sorts to create a generational effort to handle this for the next 400 years, but then I remembered that I had Robo. I talked to Fiona with Robo in the party, he offered to tend to the forest for the next 400 years, I boarded the Epoch, traveled to the present, and where once was a plain of grass was now a prosperous forest surrounding a building called Fiona's Shrine. The stupid grin on my face upon seeing this gave me a feeling no game has given me in such a long time. I can't possibly convey the depths of joy that this gave me, and somehow the good times just kept on rolling. Meeting back with Robo and Fiona's Shrine greets you with this adorable visual of everyone gathered by the campfire, and Robo talks about how he believes some sense of fate brought the time gates upon them to experience these different ages. Then, the cherry on top of this endless sundae is that Luca gets a chance to reverse her mother's injury. Dude, game, stop, it did it again. I was grinning like a dummy. It made me so happy. It's so simple, but it made me so happy. Travel to the present and Luca's mom is able to stand now. It's such an insignificant choice to make in the grand scheme of the game, but one that I know would have haunted me with guilt had I messed up and let this woman suffer from paralysis for the rest of her life. At the end of the game, she was asking Tabin to dance with her where she would otherwise be sitting at the fountain with Tabin trying to cheer her up. I mean, dude. How is a game this old, this thoroughly detailed, in regards to such a minute character? To say something negative about this game, the only part that I really didn't enjoy was the Lost Sanctum questline, which apparently was a DS version edition, so
Eels.
It certainly didn't lack in charming dialogue and creative use of time travel, but the number of times that you have to climb Mount Emerald to do nothing more than a single step of a fetch quest was completely absurd, and I mean it solely in the mind-blowingly tedious kind of way. Especially for a game that formerly did as much as possible to value your time as the player. It didn't help that I had no idea you could run away from battles, seeing as I didn't talk to this man in the tutorial house in the intro, but it still doesn't change how many damn times you have to climb this mountain if you're trying to do the entire quest line. It is optional, but I think the rest of the side quests stand far taller by comparison, and it was the only part of the game that I got really sick of after a few hours, and it even began draining my motivation to finish the game when I loved literally everything else about it. You do get tons of great weapons, items, and money out of it though. Do you know what I did not even get remotely close to being sick of though? This soundtrack. Holy shit, dude. We were in incredibly capable hands from the start with none other than the legendary composer pairing of Yasunori Mitsuda and Nobuo Uematsu. I'll talk more about Uematsu when we jump into his domain of Final Fantasy, but goddamn dude, what a legendary pairing you've got on your hands here. Mitsuda quickly became one of my favorite composers after 2020 when I experienced Peak for the first time, but I had no idea that he was largely responsible for one of the most iconic RPG soundtracks out there. It turns out that he's just built different because this was his debut work, and I would never, ever have guessed that had I not looked it up. The dude clearly put his heart and soul into this project, and as much as him working to the point of giving himself stomach ulcers is painful to hear, the consistent quality of this soundtrack is on another level, and I hope he knows how legendary the resulting pieces are. Corridors of Time is one of the best tracks I've ever heard. I could honestly listen to it for hours without getting sick of it. In fact, I already have. Damn, do I wish I had something new to say about this game, but every good thing you've already heard about it is true. This game was decades ahead of its time when it came out, and age has harmed essentially nothing about it. It very well could be the best game I've ever played, and in every sense of the word, it is a classic that has rightfully earned the mountains of praise given from RPG fans worldwide. Even if I hated every other game that I played for this video, it all would have been 100% worth it just to experience this game. It's the coldest take on the internet, I know, but Chrono Trigger is a goddamn masterpiece. While Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy were dominating the RPG space in the Super Nintendo's library, there was a less acclaimed series that was finding its footing in the shadow of its competition. While I went into this video with the goal of aiming for the big hitters, I also wanted to take a detour or two and shed light on a game that maybe not every other RPG goer has already talked about better than I have. This next one is a game that I'd heard both good and bad things about. This is Secret of Mana. If there's one word I often don't see used to encapsulate the essence of a JRPG, it's relaxing. In my experience, RPGs tend to take themselves pretty seriously in their attempt to craft as believable a world as the technology of the time will allow them to. It's not hard to see why, because when it works, it really works. Secret of Mana is unique in this respect because simply playing this game for most of the runtime is just relaxing. Nearly every component of this game made me feel like I was cuddling up in a warm blanket by a fireplace while it's snowing outside. Like, that's the general vibe I get from the whole game. The locations, simple story, serene music, and seamless combat initiation all culminate into this almost therapeutic experience. I do not think this game is the best at everything it does, but it manages to be so obscenely cohesive in this respect alone that it made the journey completely worth it. The story in this game is fairly straightforward and not looking to surprise you very much, I think it's fair to say, which aids in giving this game a laid-back vibe to it that I've seldom seen in other RPGs in quite the same vein. The Mana Fortress has risen and is draining the world of its natural life source, mana. Our protagonist, Randy, picks up the Mana Sword and is soon banished from his home village because he removed the Mana Sword and caused monsters to begin surrounding the village. It's your job to find all the Mana Seeds and stop Thanatos from causing trouble across the world with the help of Prim and Papoy. If you're looking for a deeply enthralling tale, I'm going to be honest, I don't think you're going to be finding all that much to engage with in this respect. A lot of characters and plot lines can tend to show up out of nowhere and sometimes leave the story almost as quickly as they're introduced. For example, after liberating Pandora, the water seed gets stolen by these guys, the Scorpion Army. There's something of a recurring group of villains throughout the story, so you'd think they'd get a scene establishing who they are and what they're up to, right? This is the entire establishing scene that they get. The water seed. How did you get in here? You realize we can't let you leave. Welcome. We, the Scorpion Army, will rule the world. Check it out. Shut up. We took the water seed to complete our super deluxe robot. We call it Kilroy. Hammer. Do it. Aye, sir. You beat Kilroy, get back the water seed, and then they just dip. They're just kind of like, here's the seed. Sorry, see ya. You see what I mean? Like, it's kind of hard to get a read on them as characters aside from the whole boss and underling dynamic. Nobody gets a unique name except for their group name, but that just begs the question, why the fuck are they called the Scorpion Army? I'm no zoologist, but none of you guys look like scorpions to me. Once you're in Northtown, you find this resistance group pitted against the Emperor. They get captured when you go to speak with the Emperor for his supposed truce, which gives you the impression these guys are going to be sticking by you for the finale, or at least like the lead up to the final battle, right? But no, you speak to them maybe one more time in the game, and I couldn't tell you the general personality of Chrissy or any of her fellow resistance fighters. Almost all of the story moments in this game happen so quickly you'll rarely get much of a read on any of the characters. For example, Prince Diluc is Prim's true love, and she goes all around the world to find him and basically never stops talking about him. What does he do? Why does she love him so much? Why does Thanatos choose to fuck with him specifically? Outside of Diluc being a strong vessel that Thanatos can take over to regain a functioning body, it's barely delved into. I attribute part of this possibly being due to the development struggles where apparently 40% of the game's content was cut because it was meant to be put on the CD add-on for the SNES that did an oopsie and forgot to actually exist. You can pretty clearly tell when you have to run back to this platypus man on the lofty mountains like 5 times, and when the palaces keep getting shorter and shorter, that something clearly happened here because the pacing and direction here feel pretty aimless. The narrative as a whole is incredibly simple and lends itself closer to the tone of a Saturday morning cartoon than it does a Final Fantasy or Lord of the Rings adventure, which is perfectly fine. It's nice sometimes to just get a by-the-book and goofy story as opposed to every other RPG that essentially always tries to be the coolest, most show-stopping thing out there. I'll admit I did not get attached to really any of the characters as a result, but I think the game works best as a turn-the-brain-off type of game where you let yourself get absorbed in the pretty colors and the usually relaxing music. The art direction of the game is gorgeous. Many of the areas are some of the prettiest I've seen brought to life in a Super Nintendo game, with my favorites being the Matango Forest, the Upper Land in Spring, the Ice Country, the Moon Palace, and the Pure Land. The shadows over the Matango Forest and Pure Land create this mysterious veil over the area that reminds me of walking through a woodland trail in real life. The sprite work on display here is absolutely gorgeous, and apparently the sequel is even prettier. The Ice Country's theme is another certified captures the silent essence of winter after snowfall classic. I adore the rainbow shade applied to the trees in this area. I'm just a sucker for rainbows, what can I say? For what little there is to see, I love the ethereal background of the Moon Palace and the edge of the Kakara Desert with those cute little stars buried in the sand. This game is so absurdly charming thanks to these little flourishes. The music is sitting in a weird place for me. From what I understand, this soundtrack is beloved by those who play the game, and I don't disagree, a lot of it is great, some of the best I've heard from the Super Nintendo. There's just something of a caveat there, because if a particular track doesn't gel with you, you would better pray to God you can speedrun the next area, because there's no battle theme in this game to break up the area tracks. This is at its worst in the early game and just before the end game when you'll essentially only be hearing this one area track for the first 3 hours because you're constantly running back and forth through the same area. I'd say that while simultaneously wishing that the town theme for North and South Town replaced the standard town theme. I don't care though, it's beautiful. The whole presentational front of this game has this childlike innocence to it and it's absolutely delightful. While this game was delightful, it's nevertheless a game that I find has a host of technical problems. The combat is unique from most RPGs of the era, seeing as this leans more toward an action RPG combat system, which is refreshing after playing several turn-based games in a row. You control your character like Link in A Link to the Past, but you're encouraged to wait between attacks because when your stamina bar refills, or when you later learn to charge up by holding B, you unleash a far stronger attack, which was the critical mechanic of the first entry in the series. This process keeps you from spamming attacks mindlessly and encourages clever spacing from enemies and finding the right windows of time to unleash your deadliest moves. I think this is a really creative idea, and the only way I could imagine a Super Nintendo game handling the action RPG genre with the limitations of being a top-down RPG at the same time. Side note, I love how the indication that you got a critical hit in this game isn't like a flashier damage number or anything, instead the game just tells you the Dark Lich gets whacked! That has got to be the funniest way I've seen a game indicate critical hits ever. At times, the chaotic pace of battle made me feel like I was playing Super Smash Bros. With my friends in high school again. It kept me on my toes and permitted the attack actually landed. It felt great to land the equivalent of a Falcon Punch on some poor bastard who looked at me funny. That was the thing though, if the attack landed. This game makes the, brave move to have an accuracy stat and a combat system that requires precision movement and charging attacks for upwards of 30 seconds once you make it far enough into the game. This means that roughly 20% of the time in the early game, your attacks that are aligned and timed perfectly can just miss. And I'm sorry, but that's real dumb and plainly antithetical to what the charging system should exist for. Charging exists to reward your patience, and yet the fact that you can waste your time by missing correctly timed and aligned attacks punishes your patience. It also makes it needlessly confusing trying to determine whether or not you're actually missing a wonky hitbox or if your attack is missing because of a bad roll. At times I also felt that I was barely even playing the game because the attacks that I threw out sometimes would be aligned but would miss due to accuracy. And sometimes with the right combination of assholes, I could be trapped in stun lock with no dodge button to reliably get myself out of it. The last of those was admittedly very rare, but the former two happened consistently throughout the whole game, and depending on the day, it could get pretty damn irritating. Getting in and out of combat, on the other hand, can be fairly seamless. The battles can begin and end whenever you like to, assuming it's not a boss you're dealing with. Again, this is refreshing, and you don't lack sufficient control of your AI party members, seeing as you can set their AI behaviors, and switch whenever you like, and pause by entering the menu whenever you need to heal or revive someone. The only transitions that take place are when you enter a new room, and it makes the pacing feel natural when halting for battle is almost always a choice on your part. I would have essentially no issues with this approach whatsoever if the camera actually panned over properly. This became annoying pretty quickly, alongside allies getting stuck on terrain and halting your progress. The camera can be one of your greatest enemies, and that was just for me when playing single player. It's arguably worse in multiplayer because for some reason you can only occupy this much of the screen for reasons that are beyond my comprehension. It makes me wish the collection of mana patched this game into widescreen like Chrono Trigger's PC release did. You can see basically any time I'm outside of a town, I made it a habit to stop and start walking or tiptoeing by charging up because otherwise I risk getting pot shot by enemies that I can't see coming. And that still didn't stop it from happening. There are also a few little annoyances like not seeing the names of landmarks on the map while riding Flammy and not being able to scroll through each character within the attack level menu, meaning you need to exit the menu, switch to the other person's ring, go into the menu again. In spite of these problems, the combat in this game is refreshing and fun. It's just rough around the edges in a few areas. You want to know what about the combat isn't refreshing? Grinding. Oh lordy, do you have to grind in this game. This game makes the dangerous move of taking notes from Final Fantasy II's experience system. Thankfully only in regards to the weapons and spells. However, this means that in order to keep your magic up to date, you have to be spamming that shit and keeping fairy chestnuts on you or camping out near an inn and casting for a few minutes at a time. For the weapons themselves, I don't think grinding is actually a necessity, and I think the system rewards experimentation in a compelling way via the upgrade orbs. Your base stats, gear, and upgrades to the weapons often scale sufficiently to do viable damage, and I think the orb system creates a worthwhile incentive to experiment with each weapon and see what works for you. Testing out each weapon was a rewarding process. I found that the whip, broadsword, axe, and javelin were my favorites to use, seeing as they have solid range, the animations made the big charge hits satisfying, and I could usually trust my AI companions to not kill themselves via touch damage trying to attack an enemy. Magic, on the other hand, demands grinding because you can't level up the spells without using up your mana like you can your weapons, and it takes a lot of random, purposeless casting in order to finally get them up a level. That isn't ideal in and of itself, but worse yet is that trying to beat the bosses without a full array of leveled up offensive spells on you is basically a no-go. This is the biggest issue in this game for me, boss battles. I found a dangerously high percentage of them to be completely undoable without spamming Popoy's magic. Bosses like the Great Viper and its absolute dickhead of a reskin later on are a cheap nightmare. You're constantly trying to find windows of time to use magic while also hoping he doesn't slither through whoever's casting and shit on them once they're mobile again. It's likewise a nightmare trying to charge any non-magic attack, seeing as you have to pray to God he doesn't show up behind you or move directly towards you because you can't move. For Hexus, I ended up resorting to spamming Popoy's MP absorb spell so it couldn't attack at all, and then I slowly chipped away at it because playing the intended way was just so frustrating. All I can say is thank the Lord above the collection of mana has save states, because I promise you I would have rage quit this game without a doubt had they not been there. This is one of those games like Pokemon that I feel are greatly enhanced by emulators and re-release quality of life features. I really don't see myself going back to experience the vanilla release of this game when time savers like this exist. Right, we were complaining about bosses. Whenever bosses do this jump up and slam down move, it almost always hits you if you're on the same horizontal alignment, even though it animates like the boss is only meant to be landing in this one spot, and that grows to be pretty damn annoying. Also, every single boss, aside from, I think, the Dark Lich and the Mana Beast, get the exact same theme. I don't think the composition is bad or anything, but I mean, I'd like to hear something else if you'd please. These problems for most of the game are manageable. But once you go to the Sunken Continent, all of this game's worst qualities are put front and center and in their worst form. The AI holding you back from progressing, the camera constantly obscuring enemies and obstacles from you, the shit ton of annoying enemies that seemingly at random will take no damage from magic they're supposed to be weak to, the music chosen being the most repetitive track in the soundtrack that gets awkwardly muted whenever any sound effect is playing, which is basically the whole time, the navigation looping back in on itself, and the boss fights being as frustrating as they could possibly be. Ugh. I don't enjoy whining in my videos without a point, but this has to be one of the worst segments I have played in any game. I did not have a good time. We're not done yet though. I nearly stopped playing this game altogether when I tried going to the Pure Land for the first time. After you beat the Grand Palace, the game spits you out into the overworld because the continent is sinking. So you do as you would naturally do, and you go back to the area that you just spent 3 hours in. You go to talk to Gemma, and he tells you to go to the Pure Land and power up the Mana Sword. Okay, sounds good. He and Chrissy were the only notable people I've seen here in the past 3 hours I spent, so let's take off. Wow, okay, these enemies are doing a shitload of damage to me, but this is the only place the game told me to go. Like, Gemma didn't tell me to make any more preparations than usual. What the hell? Oh, great! The worst boss in this game so far is somehow even more obnoxious. Okay, okay, yeah, you know what? Screw this. I need to stop playing. Okay, so what was I supposed to do? Like, clearly this is not what's supposed to happen. You are, apparently, supposed to walk around the back of the palace and talk to Nico, who is not visible from your landing spot, and someone you have not needed to see since you arrived at the Lofty Mountains for the first time, and buy the best armor in the game that doubles your defense. Wow, this section of the game was absolute garbage. It's a shame the game hit such low points because, all in all, I think this is a clearly flawed game that still weirdly works for me anyway by simply being a cutesy ride from start to finish. I think it makes perfect sense the game has maintained a cult following for what it did right, but it equally makes sense to me that it hasn't held up for other folks. I admire how much it was willing to experiment on so many fronts, especially with stuff like the multiplayer aspect that I wish I got to try out, but alas, I would need to not be a lonely hermit of a man. It seems like something that would essentially result in you playing a different game than those you did a single player playthrough. To give the game significant credit, it looked like a lot of fun, and I wish more RPGs were cooperative in this way because this is cool as hell. You know, I feel like thus far I've made a valiant effort to make these transitions naturally linked to the next game, but I've got to be honest, I'm running out of ideas here. Could someone else do the work for me for a little bit while I try to think of some— Oh, thank God. Final Fantasy was the JRPG juggernaut that I always longingly stared at from afar, yet for some reason or another, never really took the time to delve into. There are a lot of video games out there, and at least 1/10 of them are Final Fantasy games or remasters. There were at least 4 or 5 different entries that I knew were considered the most iconic or acclaimed, and on top of the list lay 2 games that I wanted to try more than the rest. Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy IX. 7 and its remake were so historically emblematic that I couldn't look away from them, and 9 is just a really highly rated game that, not kidding, I just wanted to play because Vivi was in it. I knew people adored him and the larger game to no end, with series director Hironobu Sakaguchi at one point stating that it was his favorite entry in the series. Naturally, instead of, doing things in a way that makes sense, I started with 9, jumped backwards to 7, then forwards again for Final Fantasy VII Remake, and then 15 was in there because it was the latest numerical entry in the series that's out, and I was interested. It seems a little bit divisive. I spent way too much time playing Final Fantasy games back to back for this video, so, luckily for you, you get the chance to listen to me spend way too much time talking about Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy IX took a little bit of time to grab me for a number of reasons that I want to rattle off right now. To start small, the original PS1 game had analog controls that, for some reason, the modern official ports of this game do not have. It is a very, very small thing, but there were some rooms in this game that felt frustrating to navigate when I was locked in 8 directions. It could be awkward in specific rooms trying to find out which direction sends me where when there was no in-between range and getting random encounters while trying to figure it out. If you're looking for a more detailed look into the various version differences, I'd recommend Austin SV's video covering each release of the game. This was actually where I learned about the Moguri mod for the first time, which seems for all intents and purposes to be the most feature-complete version to play by combining the quality of life features in the Android and Steam port with a more faithful adjustment to the art direction. There are a number of great additions, like AI upscales of the pre-rendered backgrounds, which could look jarringly blurry in the ports with the higher quality models slapped on top of them. The game can now be experienced in proper widescreen in many areas, the sample rate of the music has been increased, the textures have been redrawn in HD, the original font has been recreated, etc. After replaying bits of the game with analog movement, I would greatly enjoy replaying the game using this mod from here on out. This kind of commitment to improving the game not only made me appreciate the game itself more, but it gave me a massive spark of hope that game preservation and improvements to classic games like these are possible with the talent of fans like these folks. Z-Pilot and their team deserve significant credit for enhancing the game to this extent. If you get the game on Steam, I would highly recommend that you get the mod too, but back to talking about the proper game. It's open for debate whether I needed to or not, but I ended up grinding in this game quite a bit. Now, granted, I did not mind that much on its own because the combat in this game is really fun. While the battling can definitely take longer than I would like, particularly due to the consistently awkward periods where absolutely nothing is going on, there's a level of tension provided by the active time battle system to act quickly for efficiency's sake. And the experience payoff for most enemies is often satisfying in a way that makes the idea of starting more battles appealing. I likewise love the equipment and ability customization that always provides you with a viable reason to avoid selling off your old equipment to permanently learn new skills or spells. For how irritating random encounters can be when mixed with a game that loves taking its time when transitioning into new battles, the normal battle theme is absolutely insane and was essentially the only thing keeping me sane when I was like 3 steps away from the next room and ended up running into an enemy at the last second. The bosses were almost always intimidating, and I think FF9 helped me recognize how much each of these games made boss battles fun for me again. In a lot of the games that I grew up familiar with, boss battles rarely ever felt like a big deal. I mean, they were unique in the sense that they were stronger enemies, but they almost always have a pattern that you can recognize near instantly as the weakness you use to kill them in 3 hits. In just about all the games I'm covering in this video, the bosses actually felt like equals to me. A lot of them even put me in my place, and I can't recall a time I found it to be a formality in the way I almost always do in Mario games, for instance. I'm sorry, Mario. You know I love you. Sorry, what the hell was I initially complaining about? Right, sorry. I needed to grind a bit to beat some of the bosses in this game. The only thing I ask of you is if you're going to make me feel like it's necessary to grind for experience, then please at least make it so that it isn't boring. The first time I had to do this was in the Gizmaluke's grotto before fighting the Gizmaluke himself. God, I hope I'm pronouncing that name right. And the closest room connecting the boss room and save point seemingly had 2 possible encounters. 1. Fight your regular enemies who were challenging me at the levels I was at, but they weren't frustrating because they gave solid experience payouts. Or 2. Run into this fucking dickhead Lamia who would entice all of my party members, one-hit all of my party members except for Freya, who was the character that I wanted to be dealing damage with, but I couldn't if I needed to heal or revive anyone, and that would rarely ever let the experience payout be worthwhile because at least one of the party members would be dead every single time. These 2 incredibly juxtaposed situations were happening within a single room. I have no clue what the idea behind that must have been because it was absurdly frustrating and resulted in about an hour of me throwing my head against a wall, essentially. The second session was brought about thanks to this asshole, the Soul Cage. Oh my god. What were they on with this boss fight? So the first attempt I had against him was fairly futile because I was level 20, 22-ish, so alright, I had to grind for about an hour, but again, battling is so much fun that it really wasn't that bad for me. But the boss itself, to me, was like the epitome of everything that I can't stand about this game all being condensed into one fight. I'm going to talk more about this in a few paragraphs, but this game, if you're not familiar with Final Fantasy, can be kind of cryptic with explanations about the combat mechanics. I had no idea how to select multiple targets for spells until I looked up a guide after beating the Soul Cage and saw that this was, in fact, something I could be doing at this point in the game. The Steam version of the game doesn't tell you the shortcut for how to change between party members mid-battle with a controller. It just states that you can click on other party members with full ATB gauges, which is frustrating if you're playing with a controller because it's quite helpful if you need to react quickly to whatever a boss is doing. These things I can consider partially my fault as well as the game's fault. It's an older game and tutorials didn't seem to be as hands-on as they are nowadays, so I'll just be generous and say it was just unfortunate happenstance, right? But now, let me break down what about this fight still drives me insane. Please indulge me for at least a little bit. So, looking at the Soul Cage's design, my lizard brain fixates on the foliage on the side of its head and the fact that we're inside the fucking tree of life and thinks, okay, so fire magic is the most effective on this guy, which it is. However, there's a catch. Setting this boss on fire prompts it to get a boost in power, in particular this move, Fire Blades. Whenever you use fire magic on it, the game makes a point to say, the fire started. Now, call me whatever fun names you want, but I see that and assume that the game is saying to me, nice, you've got this guy figured out. Not, well, this is effective, but you're fucked if you don't put the fire out because this is powering him up. Even though we aren't really making that clear by stating the fact that a fire has started, like, what does that mean? Considering my man's got a level 5 death spell that he opens the fight with every single time, am I wrong in assuming that he would probably normally have a move as deadly as Fire Blades to begin with? Not only that, but Aiko recently learned the Phoenix Summon. Hence, I then assumed that this was the game's way of telling me that this was meant to be Aiko's time to shine and most of my party was just supposed to be getting wiped so she could revive them while also doing massive fire damage. Nah, it was just a summon you could use if you wanted to, I guess. Well, shit, I mean, I may have just missed a text blurb somewhere, so let's look online at youtube.com and see how other people dealt with this fight. Oh, of course you can just use healing magic or items to do damage to it because it's an undead enemy. It's not like the game never once told me that I could do that. Now, don't mistake this rant to mean that I was quaking with rage in my chair or anything. Like, honest to God, I was still having fun, and this is absurdly funny, but to call this boss a difficulty spike for non-super nerds, I think is kind of underselling it. And it sucks because the battling system was already a lot of fun at both of those points, but again, that's the thing. The game could be kind of cryptic about how to use specific party members or what their various abilities even did. I dedicated Quina to being my item spammer during their beginning stretch of the game because each time I tried to use the eat command, they wouldn't do anything. Little did I know that's apparently only meant to work when an enemy has 25% HP or lower and how Quina learns blue magic spells. Quina does give you a hint that enemies need to be weaker, but, and I apologize if I'm nitpicking here, the threshold of 25% enemy HP not being clarified, as well as the fact that Quina can declare that an enemy tastes bad and learn nothing from eating them, makes it feel extremely unreliable to commit to using the eat command. In a turn-based combat system where one move can make all the difference, I'm sorry, but I didn't find it inviting to try to experiment with that. All I can say is thank the Lord I looked up a guide, otherwise Quina would not have learned half of the spells that they did by the end of my playthrough. I'm sorry for almost exclusively harping on the game so much thus far, it's just frustrating because once I did get to understand everything a little bit better, and when I was finally given the choice to deck out my party however I wanted to, the game was like absurdly good. Like I couldn't put the game down and the music was infecting my ears whenever I wasn't playing it. I think it does take just a little bit too long to reach that capability, but man, was it gratifying to get all 8 of your party members together and finally getting that sweet, juicy party composition goodness. Steiner and Vivi together forever, baby. I think Square Enix nailed the perfect balance of making enemies in this game challenging but rewarding to fight. Whenever I did feel the need to grind, it honestly rarely felt boring in any way because the enemies felt competently imposing and the payout and experience almost always felt appropriate and it didn't keep my party at the same level for extended periods of time. I would bet that I saw the game over screen well over 40 times by the end of my playthrough, but rarely did it ever feel completely deflating to do so. I had to grind before fighting the Nova Dragon at the Aoife tree, seeing as I got completely wrecked on my first go, so I went back to the cliffside above the Gizmaluke's grotto where I previously got wiped by the regular enemies, and the game totally pulled a territorial Rothbart, man, I loved it. Goddamn, defeating the Grand Dragon felt so good that I grinded everyone up from level 33 to level 50 just to do it. For about half of that time I was consciously saying to myself that this shouldn't be as fun to me as it is, but hey, screw it, I'm having a good time. Plus, as much as the Gizmaluke pissed me off, once I got to Bermesia and Freya's storyline was put into focus, the story hooked me right back in. It was pretty shocking how dark things got after the Festival of the Hunt. Initially, Bermesia being overthrown and in ruins was sad. It didn't get me particularly in the feels, seeing as you only really see the aftermath of it, but it was sad. Then you get to Clayra and it was like I was playing an entirely different game. Clayra is introduced to you as this gorgeous ancient civilization with by far the most serene atmosphere of any area you've run into. They celebrate their ancestors through this historic dance routine. They live on this giant tree. The music is gorgeous. It's just such a beautiful locale. And then it's under attack. They spare you absolutely no details, and it makes the sequence so damn effective. This Claren family first runs into the realization that the father died at the hands of the Black Mages, then the mother lashes out at them in a rage only to get vaporized in front of you, leaving these two kids orphaned. It was just, like, God, that's just such a heartbreaking vignette right there. It was so heartbreaking, but just wait till it gets going. Freya discovers that the love of her life, who she tirelessly searched for, Sir Fratley, doesn't remember her or much of anything about himself. Beatrix then gets the magical stone, then Queen Brahne summons this nightmare fuel eidolon that effortlessly obliterates the Claren tree, killing all of those who were still panicking and trying to escape. My mouth was agape. I did not think such a horrible twist was waiting for me this soon, but there I was, right there with Freya. All of a sudden, there were multiple compelling villains to work towards beating the hell out of, there were clearly defined stakes, and there was a real sense of loss and sacrifice that clearly affected everyone in the party. It was like they flipped a switch. Even though the game was clearly setting a pattern with the fall of each nation, I thought, well, surely they wouldn't actually conquer Alexandria, right? It's Garnet's home, she just realized she was from Madain Suri and is a gifted summoner. Surely she'll pull through with a giant summon, and here it was. But the game wasn't about to let it go that easily. And so Alexandria and many of the people residing in it are obliterated. Yeah, I think that's as good a reason as any for Garnet to lose herself in her own head for a little while. There's an effective precedent set that nobody in Gaia really has a place they can call home, and if they did, it's probably gone. At that same turning point in Clayra, the game was giving me reason to resonate with the characters so much more. For the majority of the first 10 hours of this game, Steiner was a super annoying character whose dialogue essentially went in a circle. Fixate on protecting Garnet, blame/scold Zidane for something that happened, even though he probably has little reason to actually think it was Zidane's fault, get teased by Zidane, then get flustered, somehow think of a way to turn up a scheme to bring Garnet back to Alexandria, repeat for 8 hours. Then he gets partnered up with Marcus and Treno, and he begins getting, what was it? Oh, actually interesting internal conflict? Oh, my favorite. Marcus and Baku give him the reality check that he has no thoughts of his own and defines his entire personality by his allegiance to the Alexandrian family, which, you know, kind of begins to fall apart when he and Garnet get kidnapped by their own queen and learning she was responsible for multiple genocides up to that point. Call me a softie or whatever you want, but when Steiner took a stand and joined Beatrix and Freya after confronting the queen, it was really moving to me. He willingly chooses not only to leave Garnet in someone else's company, but chooses to trust Zidane of all people and makes his own decision by going with his gut. He also begins having like a surprisingly wholesome romance with Beatrix as they fight by each other's side as fierce warriors even against unshakable odds. Character development. Speaking of character development, let's just be honest with ourselves, you knew this was coming. Vivi is just the most precious lad I ever did see. It takes no time whatsoever for this kid to grow on you. He's so meek and polite, and despite the fact that you can't ever see his face, he's just the most adorable little guy ever. Look at his hat. Look at how short he is. Look at this man. What an iconic design, too. Even before I played Final Fantasy IX, this was the image I had imprinted in my brain when I thought of a mage character. I know most of it was from the original Final Fantasy, but whenever I see this design, I think of Vivi. You can't escape him. In spite of him being a literal child, he asks the most thought-provoking and adult questions in the story. His identity is constantly being put into question, and the more he learns about the origin of the Black Mages, it only leads him to ask more questions and face greater moral conundrums that we all eventually face when we grow up. Zidane says it best when he says, "You'd think with all the problems in this world, there would be more answers. It's not fair, but that's the way things are." Eventually, he begins facing his fear of stopping or dying and focuses on doing what he's able to do with his life, no matter how short or long it ends up being. I mean, it's not hard to see why this is a fan favorite character, and I did not expect them to actually have the strength to kill him off after the final battle. As depressing as it is, I respect the hell out of that commitment to the integrity of the game's existentialist themes. Everyone in this main party struggles with finding a new place to call home. As I said previously, if these people had a place to call home at some point, they lose it. And so finding a new place to call home isn't so much about finding a new place as much as it is finding comfort and safety in the people around them. By the time you get the whole crew together, it's hard to view them as anything other than a found family of misfits, and that's one of my favorite vibes to get from a main party. Zidane's your sort of flirty teenager trying to figure out his place in the world, who's always willing to lend his younger brother Vivi advice on how to live life to the fullest. Amaranth is your textbook edgy older brother, and I honestly couldn't get enough of it. Yeah, that's right. I'll lean up against the edge of the wall and be so cool doing it. Why do I have to babysit Aiko, man? I'm freaking 26 years old, Mom. Aiko's got a lot to learn, but she has enough sass to bounce off of Vivi's innocence in a really playful way. Freya has a lot more experience and wisdom than those previously mentioned and is grappling with the sudden and tragic loss of her nations. Steiner's almost like a dad or like a designated driver trying to keep everyone responsible wherever possible, but simultaneously is just so easy to tease at the same time. Garnet is Zidane's age, but has so little experience adventuring comparatively, and has all these enormous responsibilities and realities thrust upon her, like her mother becoming a maniac in her pursuit of conquest. Finally, Quina is, I guess, like that weird friend you had in high school who you see around sometimes and you and the game alike go like, oh, right, I remember you. You can join the party again. Yeah, go ahead. I can't say I know someone who likes catching and eating frogs a lot, but I mean, there are a lot of people out there. I'm sure someone can relate. The relationships between many of the party members are surprisingly wholesome. Steiner and Vivi serve as an oddly perfect pair, not only because of Steiner's sword magic being made available with Vivi in the party, but as a pairing in the story too. It's nice how Steiner finds comfort with Vivi around, and Vivi gets someone who unconditionally embraces him regardless of his status as a black mage. I loved moments like facing the demons in the 4 shrines where Steiner does as we all would do and protects this precious lad. Again, call me soft or whatever, but this scene of Vivi being incredibly nervous about missing a spell and Steiner simply responding with, I trust you, Vivi, was super touching, man. I don't care. This was one of my favorite interactions in the entire game. Amarant didn't have much going on, and apparently a lot of people aren't crazy about him, but I really like him actually. I like how even he has a logical angle about how going solo is more efficient than working with a team because, I mean, he's pretty well off on his own, but he's also a very, very lonely guy. Zidane going back into Ibsen's castle and just going like, hey, what's up, man, is like genuinely baffling to him. And I love how he immediately after seems genuinely concerned for Freya in the Fire Shrine and dismisses the way that he used to think early on. That was cute as hell, man. I really liked it. While we're mentioning Freya, she's the only character that I wish got a lot more to do in the story because after Clara and her stand with Beatrix against the Queen's Beasts, she kind of doesn't get to do much of anything. I only wish she got more to do because I almost immediately loved her and I think her design is still my favorite one in the game. Plus, she can also do this.
Surprise, motherfucker.
All of this said, if Final Fantasy IX is any kind of story, it's a romantic one. It's absolutely an epic adventure crossing the mystical worlds and discovering the truth of the world and confronting our fear of death. But the emotional core powering the engine is the relationship between Zidane and Garnet, or Dagger, whichever you prefer. It progresses in a believable way over the course of the game in that it starts out really playful. The two of them are running around, causing a ruckus in the castle, leaping around everywhere, seeing the world together, just having some plain old fun. Then stuff gets, you know, a little bit heavier, and they have to start consoling each other. And Zidane hasn't necessarily had many people to teach him how to do that in a healthy way, being with Tantalus and everything, so he clams up and he doesn't really share how he's feeling with Dagger. Plus, the two of them are still like 16 years old, experiencing depression, figuring out how to deal with incredibly adult matters, and discovering who they are. However, despite how differently they were raised, they do share something pretty massive in common. They're both orphans. Zidane's essentially been on his own for most of his life, and while Dagger has Queen Braun, it ends up being a relationship that, from what we see, almost exclusively holds her back. Since she's now a princess, she can't see the world like she desperately wants to, and once she does, the queen is nothing short of a maniac who kills herself in a desperate pursuit of world domination, leaving the remains of Alexandria in Dagger's hands. While the two may have incredibly different life experiences, Zidane and Dagger fulfill each other's needs and complement one another perfectly. Dagger finally gets to see the world, rediscovers her memories, makes a real impact on Gaia, and grows a genuine connection with people who aren't burying their feelings underneath a facade of royal formalities. Zidane, likewise, finds a purpose in his life through showing Dagger and his friends the world, providing his wisdom to them in times of need, and meets someone who accepts and loves him in a way no one else really has before. Their banter throughout the game was by far my favorite part of the story, and god damn it, you know the ending made me misty-eyed, dude. Zidane was a fantastic lead to follow for the duration of the game. I think his quote on the title screen intro describes him perfectly. You don't need a reason to help people. While being a beautiful sentiment on its own, it thoroughly explores his personality in a single sentence. I didn't really see a way the game could give him significant internal struggle, seeing as he's such a chillax and charismatic dude from the very beginning of the game, which I found to be incredibly refreshing, but Garland dropping the nuke on him that he was a genome meant to eliminate life on Gaia seemed like the ideal way to do it. Since Zidane essentially lives his life in the name of helping others and making friends, shattering his reality by telling him that he was born to destroy everyone who he cares about is the perfect instrument to crush his spirit and lead to the best sequence in the game. God damn it, You Are Not Alone is still such an incredibly powerful moment all these years later. I could not possibly fathom how hard it must have hit in 2000, and the same thing goes for the story in general. I'll admit I didn't really dig Kuja that much, and I'm not really sure why. He does a lot of messed up things, he has a cocky attitude, he seems like a huge elitist, he mirrors Zidane pretty damn well given that he's his genome brother, but I weirdly just didn't connect with him as a villain that much. There are also some parts of the story by the end where, I've got to be honest, I was kind of zoning out when it came to the lore dumps about Gaia and Terra with the souls transferring via the Ifa tree, and that could just be a me thing. That and the final boss was just, who are you? I mean, I get Kuja can't redeem himself if he was the last guy that you killed to save the world, but is his redemption really that important? Does he even really redeem himself at all? I really enjoyed the final scenes of this game, but every bit of Kuja's part in that made me roll my eyes out of my head. What do you mean he gave us all hope? Are you fucking kidding me, Vivi? What is wrong with you? He fucking killed thousands of people from Gaia and Terra and was this close to killing everyone. And now that he, what did he even do? Did he help you escape the crystal world? Now that he did that, it's just like, whatever now? I know my tone has been kind of lukewarm throughout this section, but I promise it's not because I didn't enjoy the game, because I did. A lot. I really liked it. I went out of my way to get most of the ultimate weapons and chocographs despite not ever needing to, and part of me didn't want the game to end. I think playing it again someday will only make me like it even more now that I know exactly what to expect, and again, as the Mogiri mod develops, I'll only get more thirsty for that replay. Lord knows, I'm addicted to Nobuo Uematsu's work now that I've experienced a proper Final Fantasy game firsthand, and sequences like You're Not Alone will not be leaving my head anytime soon thanks to this man's brilliant work. I'm really happy to have experienced this as my first Final Fantasy game, and for that, it'll always be really special to me. It had been a long time coming, but it was then that I was finally ready to tackle, by far, the most important game I had sitting in my backlog. The poster child of JRPGs, the almost mythical Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VII is one of the most pivotal games ever made, not just to the development of video games and storytelling done within them, but I imagine pivotal to the development of many of those who played it. Even as someone who spawned in 2001, it really isn't hard to understand how mind-blowing this game must have been in 1997. The setting is a pretty large departure from what was then seen as the typical Final Fantasy aesthetic, with your medieval imagery like castles, knights, dragons, royal lineages and such, transforming into something much more familiar to a slight fantastical twist on our present world of 1997. You've got guns, power plants, corporate overlords, television, scientists doing disgusting human experiments. Really, you've got everything. The game wasn't stored on these pesky cartridges anymore, Grandpa. It was packed into 3 discs, as if the graphics weren't all shiny and new on their own. It's like you were transcending the then known medium of video games into something entirely new, and in a way, you kind of were. Then Midgar hits you with an iconic opening segment, and then finally hits you with this moment where the scale of the world begins to settle in for you with this absolutely astounding music. This game was, and honestly, in many ways still feels, massive. I made this video for several reasons, but Final Fantasy VII is essentially the reason I wanted to go through all of this in the first place. I never played Final Fantasy until 2022, but I had heard of and seen a lot about Final Fantasy VII. It's kind of hard to completely avoid it. As bad as I feel that people are so divided on the remake, I too watched videos covering it, and it only strengthened my will to experience both of these games. So, let me tell you what it was like to experience both Final Fantasy VII and its remake back to back in 2023. Brief disclaimer, I'm using the mod manager 7th Heaven to modify my Steam copy of the game with mods for AI upscales of everything except the menus, character portraits, and FMVs, and also adding 60 FPS for the smoothest video quality and most comfortable play experience. I hope that's cool with everyone. If we're talking first impressions, I don't know if it was the sheer excitement with the fact I was experiencing one of the most beloved games ever made or what, but this entire Midgar to Nibelheim flashback portion of this game was absolutely perfect in my opinion. In my first play session, I played for 3 hours and already loved all 20 tracks in the soundtrack I'd heard that far in. I was immediately grabbed by just about everything in this whole section of the game. Midgar's societal structure and late-stage capitalist struggles, Cloud being an apathetic D-bag who's growing into Avalanche's cause bit by bit, choices that you make that actually affect how you go through certain set pieces, and the whole party you accrue that far in being charming and likable with an admirable collective goal to save the planet by any means necessary. The game gets you to care about its world pretty quickly for an RPG. It can be tricky to try to emotionally attach the player to a specific location in a game, and it's harder to get it to actually work because if you make them do too much in one area and for the wrong reasons, it can easily end up resulting in the exact opposite effect. This game manages to sidestep this problem pretty effectively. Everything about the way the game frames the conflict early on is really simple, but it's also exactly everything someone needs to find the story engaging from the first hour. You don't get more of an underdog dynamic than with Avalanche fighting a mega corporation who have created an enormous class division while destroying the planet. I mean, look at Midgar's design. It's this metallic pizza surrounded by desert wastelands and smog covering the sky, making it ambiguous whether the residents can even tell if it's day or night. You don't really need to know that much about Heidegger, Hojo, Sung, or President Shinra to see that Shinra is messing this world up, and these guys aren't going to be changing their ways anytime soon because what do they seek to benefit from it? What's the deal with capitalism? The visual design alone does enough to convey the idea that this planet is suffering due to the overuse of Mako reactors. You don't need to know about the life stream and the souls of the planet, although it does help, to completely buy that, yeah, Shinra is completely fucking the planet over. This much quickly communicates why they're an effective villainous presence without even going into the never-ending list of atrocities they're responsible for. Shinra feels almost larger than the world itself. They've essentially got the world itself in a bind, and that does a lot to always keep your party at a disadvantage in such a way that leveling up is never really going to quell. Who's to say what new shit they've got up their sleeve? They have all the resources in the world to make whatever they want. This is already excellent, but then you get the best of both worlds with Sephiroth being the second villainous entity to go up against. Sephiroth is one of the best villains I've ever had the pleasure of encountering. Instead of, I don't know, I'm just spitballing here. Him showing up excessively to the point where you start having trouble taking him seriously, you spend most of the game not understanding who or what he really is because you don't see him much at all. He's almost like a fleeting dream you wake up from. He'll show up and do something, but then you'll wake up and go, wait, what the hell was that? Did that just happen? How much of that was real? He manages to be scary because you often are hearing secondhand information about him from NPCs like if you ever do see him, it's a guarantee your party's gonna regret it. Of course, eventually you do catch up, but stuff starts getting weird. Somehow Genova is reanimating herself. Whenever Cloud gets close to Sephiroth, he begins zonking out. Enough so that he kindly delivers the world-ending black materia straight into Sephiroth's hands. Great! What else could go wrong? Well, you know. I braced myself for it, and it still hurt. It was never going to surprise me. This game is way too celebrated to not know about this. But I suppose that's why it's still such a great twist all these years later, because even knowing that it was coming didn't stop it from hurting. Oddly, being spoiled only further enhanced the game's commentary surrounding death and the impact your loved ones have on you in the past, present, and even in the future when they're not there anymore. Preparing yourself for the pain doesn't keep it from stinging, especially when someone you care about is taken away from you. You just can't help it. When that person is never again going to smile, laugh, cry, or feel, it's an injustice you can never make right. Although, I mean, you could use a phoenix down in this case, but that's besides the point. It will always hurt. To get a little personal for a minute, I'm not a particularly religious fellow. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with being religious, I just do not subscribe to a specific one myself at this point in my life. What I did not expect going into this game was that it put into words a far greater realization of my kind of nebulous take on the afterlife and planetary energy. While I really didn't have any way of understanding how to put this, I recently have been thinking about Earth, nature, and the cycle of life and how it all seems to connect to us when we die. To me, nature is so unlike anything else in our world that instead of the existence of a god, I've pondered that maybe the planet itself could have its own consciousness or way of orchestrating things. I'm not absolutely sold on this idea, to be clear, but it's a weird headcanon I like believing in. Final Fantasy VII, funnily enough, created a world around that concept and explores it in a fascinating and emotional way. The livestream exposition dump, strangely, made me feel seen, as much as an exposition dump could manage to, anyway. Everything I had tried to explore in my own head being put on the screen and explored through these fantastical concepts was strangely the most grounded thing about the game's world for me. All of life's energy pooling into the livestream, despite not having an explainable basis to go off of in real life, immediately made so much sense to me. I immediately just got it. Those who pass on aren't gone from this world, not truly, for they coalesce into the livestream. This only makes Shinra and Sephiroth even more hateable. Shinra for draining the souls of the dead for thicker profit margins in Mako energy, how heartless can you get, and Sephiroth for seeking to destroy the world to absorb all the souls of the planet for his own ascension to godhood. I just love thinking about this plot device. To me, it's what ties all the agents of this game's plot and story together to contextualize everything. What makes the villains, why the party's fight is one you can get behind, why the game's commentary surrounding life and death and grappling with both is so rich, and why Cloud and his friends are so lovable. It makes the planet, or even the wider universe to an extent, into a character with just as much agency in the plot as Shinra, Sephiroth, and the party. When the black materia is activated and Weapon wakes up, you can practically hear the planet going, "Oh, for fuck's sake, guys, can't a globe get some beauty sleep without one of you assholes ruining it for everyone else?" Speaking of ruining things for everyone else, much like how the livestream sequence felt like the game was speaking directly to me, the game's fairly dystopian commentary surrounding late-stage capitalism did the exact same thing. With wages in the United States completely stagnating while corporate productivity and cost of living are skyrocketing, it is horribly depressing but simultaneously weirdly comforting to see that a game from 1997 understood exactly what a world similar to that would look like, except with funny cat robots and magic and crystals that summon godly beings and chickens. Okay, so it's extremely different, but they knew what the result of this societal structure would be. The climate crisis for the planet too, dear lord. I wish that wasn't something I was thinking about when playing a game where you're on a quest to kill a god. It does a great deal to help you relate to everyone, including NPCs. You get the idea that everyone's just trying to make the most of their situation. Everyone blames Shinra, but what can they do about it? Shinra is too big to fail and controls the global scale police force. Any kind of rebellion would be squashed like a bug, but that's also why we have the most mentally unwell crew of warriors to step up to the plate and take care of that for us. The story is arguably what makes the game so beloved in the first place, but it's not for a lack of entertaining gameplay, because this game is rock solid in that respect, for the most part. The key thing holding it back for me is that the navigation is frustratingly unclear at points. For me, this was at its worst after obtaining the Tiny Bronco. Your next location is the Temple of the Ancients, which is eccentric looking and ominous, so it's straightforward to intuit you are supposed to go there. However, you need the keystone to do anything here. Where is that? It was originally in possession of this weapon maker on the coast east of Gungaga. He tells you that he sold it to a rich dude at the Gold Saucer. I initially thought you could just walk back up to the Gold Saucer and ascend it from the desert level, but I forgot that I couldn't. Also, brief disclaimer, in both video games and in real life, I am terrible with maps. I ended up doing several laps around the world map for nearly an hour before I remembered how to go back to the ropeway station. Only for Ketchi to fuck around and give the keystone to Shinra so they could enter the Temple of the Ancients and do nothing, because Sung just gives you the keystone anyway, so the only real substantive thing you're doing throughout this entire section of the game is go on a date with Aerith, or Barrett, or Tifa, and realize that you can't trust Ketchi. Even though everybody, aside from Cloud and Barrett at this point in the story, is basically like, it's whatever, you weren't essentially an informant for the guys we've been trying to stay ahead of the entire fucking game so far. Oh, and by the way, is holding Marlene captive? Yeah, we can trust you implicitly, we may as well keep you around. Then it's never brought up until 12 hours later. Why would you do this? This is far from the most obtuse example, by the way. I hope we're all on the same page that the key of the Ancients is hidden where nobody's intuition would lead them naturally. This was nevertheless the point where I realized having a guide handy would mitigate additional frustrations in this respect, and it did. I think the game prior to this point was decent at this. NPCs were emphasized enough that I would comfortably find the way forward, but after this point the game is kind of hit and miss with it. This is also compounded by the occasionally mistranslated and dated script. There are still several major interactions I've reread and tried to interpret in different ways where I'm still confused about the intention and tone of some entire paragraphs of dialogue. Sometimes the choice of grammar can make it seem like something I would write in one of my scripts in 6th grade. I know, it was 1997. Nevertheless, these are things that do date the experience in a way that I have trouble overlooking. Like, I don't mind the game being in 4x3 or the character models being blocky. The game's strengths do more than enough to immerse me regardless of those things. The music, characters, cutscenes, and story still work wonders to this very day. These two things, on the other hand, make it most apparent this game was made over 2 decades ago. Obligatory rant aside, the gameplay in this game is really solid. There are a lot of minigames and set pieces that shake things up between battling segments, and you rarely feel like you're ever doing too much of any one thing. Battling felt surprisingly swift, and I think that had a lot to do with the fact that Final Fantasy IX was my first game in the series, because this feels like transcending the laws of time and space compared to that game. Downtime is present, but in just the right intervals where you can plan your next moves carefully, but you don't get too much. Unless you use one of the summons, but I think that's a fair trade-off for them costing so much MP. You get to build your funny little dudes however you want to thanks to the materia system. The depths of this system are boundless, and while I was too stupid to really figure out all of this for myself, just looking up how you can outfit your gear online blew my feeble little brain. If you have enough leveled up magic counter and mind materia, you can counter an enemy with the strongest summon in the game and spend nearly 10 minutes watching the animation play over and over and over and over again. That may be one of the funniest ways to kill 10 minutes I've ever heard of. You can utilize all kinds of additional command like enemy skills, manipulation, and sensing enemy stats alongside your usual healing, reviving, and elemental spells. This game has an enormous pool of enemy designs, and I love so many of them. They texture the world incredibly well, and I forgot to give Final Fantasy IX proper kudos in that respect. I always loved running into new enemies and seeing what kind of ridiculous statuses they can inflict, although I do have to say I hate how this game doesn't have the help explanations for what each item does during battle. It's especially bad in this game because holy shit, I'm sorry, there are way too many items that cure individual ailments and there's no way in hell I'm memorizing all of that, I'm sorry. Especially for statuses like sadness, fury, yeah, alright, it's time to whip out the spreadsheet, or just use Asuna. Asuna? How do you fucking whatever. The variety of bosses doesn't disappoint, and I didn't have as many memorable encounters as I did in Final Fantasy IX, although I do hate the robot arm boss. I had a bitch of a time on Hojo's third phase, and also figuring out that apparently Sephiroth's core thing has two different halves to attack. That did not make sense to me. Outside of that, I don't really have much more to add about the combat. It's just solid turn-based goodness. If I'm willing to sit down for several hours until midnight trying to get the final attack materia despite losing the battle arena gauntlet over and over and over again, I think it's a good sign. Not in terms of what I'm willing to spend my time on, but for the sake of illustrating that the combat is fun. When I do another playthrough, I want to experiment with materia a lot more. I feel like there's so much potential that for most of the game I just didn't explore. The minigames are interesting. They certainly had no shortage of ideas for little side attractions for the new age of Final Fantasy. You've got snowboarding, arm wrestling, anime, this tower defense game that makes me want to chew shards of broken glass, submarine chases, Call of Duty lobby etiquette. Really, you've got everything. Although everything, unfortunately, means everything. Some of these minigames seem like they were PS1 tech demos that Square saw and said, hey, we need to fill another 5 minutes in the big new Final Fantasy game. We can use that. Most of these are over before you know it, and the worst ones are usually inoffensive at worst. But some of them feel like half of the game is trying to figure out what the object of the game even is. I point again to Fort Condor's tower defense. Holy shit, do you expect me to remember half of this Wikipedia page's worth of information for one minigame? I didn't. It doesn't help that it drains actual gil from your wallet either, but I digress. If I can say one unanimously great thing about these minigames, it's that they keep the game's sense of humor intact even when Cloud's having an existential crisis. This game has a really charming sense of humor to it, and it isn't just metatextual stuff like memes or mistranslations. I cackled reading Cloud saying, listen, Yuffie, I don't care about the history of Wutai or your feelings. That is some of the coldest shit I've heard a main character say in my life. Oh my god, I need that to be in the remake project somehow. Please, Square, somehow, some way, get that into the game. The animations do a lot of heavy lifting here. Obviously, you can only get so much range out of these, how you say, primitive models, but the frantic movements every character makes rides a fine line between being cutesy and also the funniest thing to be in one of the most iconic games of all time that commentates on life and death. I truly don't know how the game manages to be so immersive that I stop seeing polygonal block people and instead see Cloud, Tifa, and Sephiroth. But I think it's a testament to the game's ability to tell its story using every tool video games can use about as well as it realistically could, especially for 1997. Memorable is the word that I think encapsulates Final Fantasy VII best. This game excels at making an abundance of moments that will stay with you long after you're finished, and I think it's the game's best strength and a huge reason why the game's legacy has not even come close to fading from public consciousness, even with the remake in mind. This game understands exactly how and when to time its huge, mind-blowing plot twists and character deaths, with goofy little minigames, boss battles, heart-to-hearts, and those rare triumphant victories. The best thing is that this game does all of this and uses the medium of video games to tell its story more effectively than most games I've played. The early game Nibelheim flashback with Sephiroth for me is the ideal example, alongside Aerith's death feeling massive for you because as a player, you're losing something substantial by losing an effective healer and her bubbly personality in the story. Just before Aerith's death, the game uses a lack of choice too in a really effective way by disconnecting you from Cloud. Whoa, buddy, what are you doing? I don't want to do this. Cloud, what's going on? Please don't do this. It shows just how hard it must be for Cloud to keep it together with Genova's cells fighting him every step of the way, so much so that you actually understand and feel why Cloud was able to give the black materia to Sephiroth. I praised Chrono Trigger for giving you choices that actually mean something, even if they're small, and this game follows suit despite only having one ending. Be it small dialogue options like giving the flower to Tifa or Marlene, whether you tell Tifa it's gonna be alright like a real cool guy or normally, even how Cloud tells his story about invading Tifa's home. But you can also change major gameplay segments by choosing how you're gonna climb the Shinra building, or whether you even want to fight the Turks after Shinra crumbles. Again, even if it's small stuff like this, it goes a long way. What immortalizes this game above anything else, though, is the transcendent soundtrack. This game's OST is not of this world. I know I have spoken almost nothing but praise for all of these soundtracks, but this is straight up unmatched by most soundtracks found in any form of media, if you ask me. I don't believe any work of art is above criticism, but this soundtrack deserves to be written in history books and preserved in every way it possibly can be. It is that goddamn good. It's easily among the best I've ever heard, and at points I'm convinced I was primarily motivated to keep playing just so I could hear the next earworm. The only bad thing I can say about it is that the random encounters leaping into the aggressive opening measures of the battle theme does grate on you after a while. It doesn't stop it from kicking ass though, and the victory fanfare is no different. This game's best moments are, to no one's surprise, often hoisted on the backs of whichever track kicks in. Everyone points to One Winged Angel, but how couldn't they? How could someone forget the first time they heard this shit in a video game? Even the downtime or otherwise mundane moments still keep you marching on, because how could this not hype you up, dude? I doubt I said anything about this game that hasn't been said before or better, but it was a treat being able to experience this classic game and truly understanding the magic that made it a legend. It's the kind of game that makes me hope, and makes me pray I can somehow impact the world in a positive way like this game did. It inspires hope within me, and if I can say that about a game that's 26 years old, it's not difficult to understand why it's one of the most beloved games ever made. Oh my dear God, is this next one a doozy.
Oh shit. Okay. Yo, I got purple pants cause I'm running all around. I got my name from Rippin' Fat Cloud.
Final Fantasy VII Remake is one of the most games of all time. Final Fantasy VII is one of the most pivotal games ever made, not just to the development of video games and storytelling done within them, but I imagine pivotal to the development of many of those who played it. I do not envy the developers of this remake being in the position they're in, both as a result of factors they very much can and very much cannot control. When you're remaking a game like Final Fantasy VII, odds are you're not only competing with the original game's quality, but also the memory of that original game that many people have. Not to say nostalgia overpowers everyone's opinion if they had an attachment to the original. I don't believe nostalgia is that powerful. I mean to say that I can't imagine the original game's flaws have been what sat with people when they thought back on the game's legacy in gaming history. With this being one of the most hotly anticipated video game remakes, it's difficult to picture a more daunting task to put in front of a staff of developers. The direction they chose to take with this game is certainly a bold one, and I can respect that in a sense. I love when a game or any work of art believes so strongly in what it's going for that it goes all in on that vision. While I may enjoy it, this direction Square has decided this remake is going to take is a direction that I feel is appealing to a fairly niche demographic of people, and it makes the game's identity feel muddled and messy. Now, I enjoy this game quite a lot, actually. I'm also gonna be that guy and say that I'm kind of sick of remakes. At one point, remakes felt like a chance to go back and update older games and make them more accessible to the current gaming demographic. Now for me, it feels like a never-ending excuse to recycle ideas from the most popular games that people already love and have aged just fine, and then release them again, but this time the graphics are better and there may be a collection of differences too, I guess. I do not mean to diss the developers who work on remakes at all. Remakes are their own beast to tackle, and they come with their own laundry list of expectations and standards, even more so than what's already expected of you when you're making a AAA game in the first place. You've got to consider so many different elements: the fan reception of what most of the fans loved about the original intention of the developers, what you loved about the original, and what you think could stand to be updated. Without taking it too far though, because if you change too much, it may no longer feel like the original game. The biggest reason this bothers me this much is that it seems like they're only requiring more and more manpower to complete as time marches forward. Games are already taking longer to make than ever, development cycles are only getting longer as the technology evolves, and if you cut corners in even the smallest visual details, it will end up on Twitter and be the topic of the gaming sphere for an entire day or two. God, isn't living just the best? What I'm trying to get at here is this. Think about the talented ass people working on these remakes and what they could do if they just made whatever game they wanted to instead of revising someone else's work. I suppose this all comes down to how I wish much more effort could go into preserving those original experiences and making them available on the current platforms, with remakes being the secondary concern instead of the inverse. None of this is to say that because I don't see value in some remakes, they're just completely invalidated. Not at all. As I said, there are talented ass people working on these games. I just personally tend to find remakes to only ever be exciting when they serve as a revival for a franchise or a game that isn't already etched into every gamer's mind. In this way, Final Fantasy VII Remake is very exciting to me. Thanks to the talk of this game being so wildly different from the original game, I had a reason to not completely abandon the PlayStation 1 original, which thankfully is a game that has been well preserved and made accessible on pretty much every platform you'd want it to be on. This remake being created this way made it so that I instead had a reason to play the remake after having played the original instead of using the remake as a replacement for the original. I played and loved the original Final Fantasy VII, but I also already went on that epic journey. It wasn't perfect, and I definitely understand why your average player in 2023 wouldn't be as impressed by it as I was. We'll get to that in a minute, but I don't think experiencing a remake that just recreates that game but in 2020 is something I personally really need or want. That said, I absolutely can see part of the appeal there, and this game has its share of moments that make a strong case for why a straight-up recreation could dramatically improve some already excellent parts of the original game. At the end of the day though, if I were to see more out of the Final Fantasy VII universe, unless it's something entirely new, I'd personally rather just replay the original game as opposed to experiencing it again, but the presentation is updated. Since the remake, or I suppose the unknown saga as I'll be calling it, isn't really a remake, I'm actually excited to see what happens when these characters I love go on a new adventure where I don't know where the train is headed. This is actually something new, and I want to see where this is all going. However, this is because I already played the original, and there are plenty of people who haven't or have trouble doing so in this day and age. People who wanted to experience that epic journey for themselves but without the jankiness of the original. If we're being honest here, nerds like me do not make up the overwhelming majority of folks who play video games today. We certainly take up a significant percentage, to be sure, but your average Joe, somebody who doesn't write about video games or just plays them casually, isn't going to get their kid this game from 1997 when what you believe to be a shiny and new version of it is sitting right there. Some of you have to know what it's like to have parents who have confused one game for another one. If they're not into video games themselves, it's a very understandable thing to mix up Pokemon Scarlet with Pokemon Sword. Just imagine how many parents have done the same thing here. But here's the other thing. No child that has played any sort of modern game beforehand is going to pick up the original Final Fantasy VII and think, wow, while it may be dated, it's perfectly understandable how this game established such a historic legacy and changed the landscape of video games forever. I'd imagine they're probably going to A, get lost and lose interest, or B, say this game is old and sucks balls. However, if they even want to understand what the fuck is going on in the final chapters of this remake, then they need the context of the original game's events to understand most of it. I played this game alongside a good friend and coworker who hadn't played the original game, and over the course of a couple months we reported back to each other about the progress we were making. It was so much fun. I forgot how fun it was to play games alongside other people in that way, and it was so refreshing to hear his perspective as someone who didn't have the original game to compare it to. However, by a certain point, I began to realize that had I not been there to nerd out to him about what happens in the original, I'm not confident this game gave him sufficient background on these events for someone in his position to understand what the fuck it's even trying to say. Barrett's fake-out death, Zack and Biggs being alive, Aerith having knowledge of the future, I guess, Sephiroth's aggressive presence, and the Whispers of Fate, they all really don't mean anything unless you know that this wasn't in the original Midgar portion of the OG. Would any regular person without a playthrough of the original under their belt even think about any of that without some nerd like me there to share my surprise in seeing things like a Sephiroth encounter after the first hour? This is what I meant before about the game's identity being messy and muddled, because it's simultaneously asking that you play the original, watch a story summary, or have some nerd like me there to explain it to you just to understand the events of this game, but also that you're completely on board with what transforms into an alternate timeline of Final Fantasy VII when there's a high probability you just wanted to play the Final Fantasy VII Remake. I do not blame anyone for feeling the way they do about this game. The direction it took is absolutely not engineered to please everyone, and there's nothing wrong with expressing disappointment with that. The fact is, I can't imagine many people were frothing at the mouth to play Final Fantasy VII The Unknown Journey for 10 years. They were doing that for a remake of Final Fantasy VII, a concept that Square put in front of their fans for a long time. I consider myself lucky that I didn't get on the hype train until after the remake came out, because I could see myself feeling disappointed by that curveball too. But as someone who just recently played and loved Final Fantasy VII, and as someone who actually, believe it or not, does err on the positive side when it comes to this game, how about I start plunging into talk about the actual game? This is the best looking game I've ever seen, period. I tend to prefer my games with bright and stupid colors, and generally don't find myself in love with the games that make realism the priority of the art direction. I grew up mostly playing Nintendo games, so you'll have to forgive me. Even though this game tends to have notable stretches of primarily blue and gray locations, this game is drop dead gorgeous. Playing on PC in 1440p with 60 FPS really is a treat, even if some of the more populated areas can kind of run like booty, and even if I can't figure out why OBS is such a pain in the ass that can't consistently record the game at 60 frames per second for some reason. Ugh. It's so smooth, and even though the obnoxious walking segments can take up more of the game than I would like, part of me thinks I would take it slow anyways just to soak in the atmosphere and detail put into even the most minimally used locations from the original. From the opening minutes of gameplay, it was already clear what an undertaking these environments must have been to create. Just after entering the train station, you already see 10 times the amount of detail that was in the original game's equivalent. You see vending machines, Shinra advertisements, posters, ATMs, the train station timetables, who knows how many different cones and boxes to kick around, steam rising from the pipelines on the outside, a billion different light sources, and I'm sure there are still 20 different things I'm not even consciously recognizing here. Also, I'm just kidding about this being 10 times as detailed because this room isn't even in the original game. Do you want to think about how many hours that would have taken to get into a finished state? I couldn't tell you, and you're in there for a minute, maybe. The walking simulator aspect of this game is criticized a lot, and as I said, I share that same criticism, but I do think it's fair for the developers to indulge in some self-appreciation where it's appropriate. The updated character designs all distinguish each character greatly from one another, even if their original designs were as minimal as you could get away with. Biggs in the original game looked like and essentially played the role of a random NPC. He has a headband and a green shirt, and he otherwise fits in with every other character that you saw in the slums. In this game, Biggs' design and voice acting not only better distinguishes him from any other rando in Sector 7, but you already get a gist of his personality and his rapport with his fellow Avalanche fighters just looking at him. You see these guys together and you can already see the group of lovable dorks they are. It's hard to think of anything memorable Biggs does in the original game other than die and make Barrett sad because that happened. By contrast, Remake gives him and Wedge a charming dude bro back and forth, and he gets a real personality, being incredibly worried about every possible thing, but also being dependable and wanting to look out for Jesse and Wedge especially. He also served as a mentor for Miss Folia in Sector 5, and it's a superfluous detail, sure, but stuff like this makes me give a shit about him. I had no expectation I would care about Biggs at all, and he was the character I walked away thinking about the most after I beat Chapter 4, the chapter almost entirely dedicated to Jesse's background. When he was on his last legs at the Sector 7 pillar, his speech made me well up. In spite of being, for all intents and purposes, a random NPC in the original, I care about Biggs, Wedge, and Jesse a lot in this game. Also, can we take the time to acknowledge the fact that Wedge was voiced by Matt fucking Jones? I don't know what it is about this guy, but every time he shows up in something, it makes me irrationally giggly. I guess I just automatically see him as Badger from Breaking Bad, not to be mean or anything. I'm sure he's a cool guy. Also, is it just me or does Johnny sound kind of familiar?
You got it, boss. You ain't never gonna see my face again. I swear. Like what exactly? Damn it, I've heard enough of this bullshit. Give me a straight answer.
Huh. Small world, ain't it? It's clear that the developers poured hours and hours of labor and love into this game, and to me it's simultaneously clear that there is an intense respect for the original game present, even if a lot of what was in the original is being altered. The recreation of the numerous iconic money shots and locations from the original Midgar have received all the care I could possibly want. Right from the opening cutscene and hearing the orchestrated rendition of the bombing mission theme, I already got chills. I don't know how cold you'd have to be to keep yourself from getting just a little giddy. While we're highlighting the music, I see no better time than now to highlight this game's lovingly crafted, orchestrated soundtrack. Many of Uematsu's iconic pieces have been recreated with an admittedly less distinct sound font compared to the original, but the higher fidelity and more dynamic instrumentation really heightens the immersion in these already hypnotic pieces. I connected the most with Sector 5's new original theme, Hollow Skies. I don't know how to describe what this song makes me feel, but I know what this feels like. This dread, this despair you feel when you look around. I feel that looming air of sadness. It was a track I listened to regularly after reaching the Sector 5 part of the game, and to my very pleasant surprise, it ended up getting the privilege of being the vocal end credits theme. And that made me very happy as I sat and tried to process everything that just happened. Avalanche's new original theme was another favorite of mine. Now I have a song to associate with this ragtag group of rebels that I didn't have before. Hearing the motif be reused during the Pillar collapse as well as the ascent up to Shinra HQ were both deeply resonant emotional moments for me, and I say that as someone who knows too little about this stuff. Let the Battles Begin has received who knows how many different remixes, and this remedies the one critique I had about the original battle theme. Again, still a bop, but after the 97th random encounter, your appreciation, believe it or not, it begins to wane just a little bit. The myriad of remixes helps to give each boss and area a decided aura while still being true to Uematsu's original compositions. I probably could have gone the whole game without hearing the main theme and One Winged Angel before the memorable moments they first played in the original game, but I digress. This game gets critiqued for many of its additions being padding or otherwise unnecessary bloat, and I can definitely see where those opinions are coming from. Midgar's purpose in this remake project evidently seems to be going for something entirely different from the small blip on the map it was in the original, as if it getting its own dedicated game didn't give that away already. The scale has been expanded to an absurd degree, and evidently this seems like the kind of thing you either really dig or can't stand. I enjoy a majority of the new additions to the story, and especially appreciate the greater emphasis on the wealth disparity between the people in the slums and everybody associated with Shinra. Chapter 14 was when this really hit hardest for me. After spending roughly 5 hours helping everyone on the ground level and returning to Corneo's mansion, I suddenly got hit by this wave of disgust. This slimy piece of garbage gets to live this lavish life and call the shots around Wall Market, not to mention that whole sex trafficking thing, hot take, that's also pretty vile and disgusting. He gets to do all of that with no restraint, while people like Miss Folia or their local doctor, people who are selfless members of their community, hugely contributing to its well-being, get stuck living with the bare essentials, and that's if they're lucky. Corneo couldn't better fit the typecast for a lizard person if he tried, and yet he gets the luxury and protection no one else does. It was one of those things that honestly made me upset to think about, and I aligned more and more with Barrett as things continued from there. Getting a chance for Barrett to confront President Shinra himself felt incredible, and I'm honestly torn whether I preferred that character moment or Sephiroth's cute little decoration he leaves in the original game. As I said, I can see why people aren't thrilled about things like the train graveyard story, Hojo's fucking lab, and the walking and sidling for 30 minutes, because I don't like those places or those segments either. But I also doubt I would have reacted this way had this game not gone to these absurd depths to expand on Midgar. I also think it's great at showing you how disconnected the Shinra higher-ups are from the people whose lives they control, or even from each other. When Rufus took the throne of Shinra, I thought it was an honest error on the writers' part for not having him bring up his dad's death at all, but in this remake I realized that maybe he just didn't give a shit after all. Rufus seems happy, honestly, and nobody mourned for the president for even a second, not even his own son. Thinking more on it, I somehow doubt the same man that would happily greenlight the death of thousands of innocent people because of a half-dozen eco-terrorists would make for a good, upstanding father figure, but that's just my guess. While we're on the subject, what has received the most rigorous care and attention to detail is the presentation and writing of these characters. I thought this was an impressively engaging aspect of the original, but when you're reading text boxes, occasionally mistranslated text boxes at that, there's something for me there that's missing. It's hard for me to describe. It's part of why a lot of older Zeldas and top-down RPGs have trouble engaging me with their story or characters. I feel like I oftentimes need more to forge an unbreakable connection with a character aside from dialogue. That said, I already felt that, considering my pickiness, the character work in the original game was already top-notch and drove that story effortlessly. Yet somehow, some way, this aspect of the remake still ended up blowing my hair back. I've already mentioned Biggs and Avalanche in general, but I cannot think of a character I don't greatly enjoy in this game, save for one unfortunate one. Cloud in the original game was a fantastic main character, but part of me felt that in terms of the superfluous aspect of his personality, he was kind of plain. I formed a strong connection with him for sure, but it was less so for his personality and more so for his messed up backstory and his motivations. Final Fantasy VII Remake solidified Cloud as one of my favorite RPG protagonists yet, specifically because that personality is brought to life in a way where I can completely buy the love for this character. I love this fucking guy. I love seeing this cold and money-driven assbag turn into a big dumb idiot who would jump to do anything to save his friends. I love the way you can see him open up with each passing chapter, especially after he meets Aerith and she teaches him how to high-five someone. I love how cool he thinks he is while being the biggest dork on the planet. I just never get enough of it. My only gripe with how they handled Cloud is that I think the game goes a bit overboard with his Genova-induced stress-related flashes of green. This is one of the areas where I think expanding and getting a more accurate idea of what's going on kind of hurts the remake. Whenever these happened in the original game, I took a guess that it was just a quick flash where time stopped for Cloud and everybody else just saw him briefly space out for a minute. This only bothers me in this game because every character sees Cloud regularly having these long, stressful episodes, and him just going, yeah, whatever, I'm good, is enough to convince them that everything is cool. Clearly it's not! Get this guy to a doctor or a therapist. Apparently everyone's too busy staring into his beautiful Mako-fused eyes to give a shit, because this man couldn't be swimming in more ladies if he was trying. Jesus, I didn't think I would ever be jealous of this guy, but wow, they threw everything in the kitchen sink at me. Barrett was, similarly, a character who I felt sympathy and empathy for in the original game, but ended up adoring every second I saw him in this remake. Both his emotional and humorous moments are some of the highlights of this game for me. His and Cloud's dynamic was absolutely hilarious, and seeing it progress over the course of the story was more engaging than it had any right to be. Cloud shooting down Barrett's speeches and questioning his belief in the cause, transforming into Cloud pleading that Barrett protects the party while he covers them, creates a great emotional arc to follow for the Midgar portion of a much larger story. I cannot wait to see it progress further in the later entries. It may actually be the relationship I'm most interested in seeing more of. Barrett's passionate and headstrong attitude is brought out in full force to be this party's much needed leader, and you get a much greater idea of how much he is or isn't pulling Cloud out of his apathy. Barrett's talks with Marlene and his breakdown at the Sector 7 plate collapse made my eyes water, and John Eric Bentley contributed a truly exceptional performance to this project. Everyone's voice acting was spotless, whether they were major party members or one-offs like Don Corneo or Koch and Scotch. The game was likewise spotless when it came to the polish. I couldn't name a single glitch I ran into for my whole playthrough, and this game has got a ton of dynamic set pieces, walking segments, mini-games, enemy encounters, and multi-stage boss fights, and I didn't notice a damn thing. Nothing worth sternly criticizing, anyway. Square Enix is clearly putting their all into this saga so far, and the dedication doesn't go unnoticed. For both better and worse, this is the most AAA of AAA games I have played within the last few years. I don't want to ramble on about the characters for forever, but it was such a driving motivator for me that it's impossible to overstate. Tifa and Aerith were great companions for a dork like Cloud to be accompanied by, teaching him the ropes of being a merc and gaining connections in their respective communities, and also influencing him to open up a bit more. I'm absolutely sold on the romantic tensions between both of them with Cloud, and it feels like a mutual dynamic when it comes to bailing each other out. It doesn't feel like Cloud is the dude saving the damsels as much as it feels like the three of them care about each other and just want to help out however they can. Cloud's almost willing to let Tifa handle Corneo on her own, but Aerith knows how much of a slimeball Corneo is and talks him into helping her, and it doesn't feel forced. The love triangle aspect of their trio feels significantly more believable in this game as well. In the original, Tifa has so much more of an influence on Cloud's early life and gets so many more bonding moments with him by the end of the game that it doesn't even feel like a competition. I always got the idea that Aerith and Cloud were just really good friends who flirted every now and then, you know? In the remake, I kinda get why there's this much tension now. The exploration of some of the more superfluous details of their personalities make them both lovable for occasionally different reasons. More than anything about the future entries, I'm looking forward to seeing the whole party get together and how they'll all translate into this new style of presentation. Sid was kind of a dick in the original, and I'm curious if he'll be made more sympathetic or how they're gonna handle him. I'm also so down to see more out of Vincent and Yuffie. I already felt like after the original game ended, you could see these guys sticking together and patching this world back together, and I'll bet this saga can elevate that feeling to new heights if they keep it up. Oh shit, I haven't talked about the gameplay at all and I've been talking for this long. This game's combat system is a pretty brilliant synthesis of two seemingly opposed combat systems. The original strategy of the PlayStation 1 game is largely preserved by dictating spell, ability, and item usage through your ATB gauge, but it's also mixed with an update to Final Fantasy XV's more action-focused and immersive combat encounters. Item use now has a calculable opportunity cost, unlike item use in 15, but you still get to keep that game's larger-than-life set pieces and boss fights alongside the incredibly unique different character skill sets. Materia, despite not being as much fun to toy with as it is in the original, still provides you with no shortage of options to experiment with in the amount of time you spend in Midgar. Seeing as Tifa builds ATB incredibly quickly, I gave her the Item Master Materia, and it made the prospect of using an ATB bar on a low-level potion actually worthwhile. I loved the variety present in each character's moveset. Getting unique abilities for each character made your growth tangible, while not trivializing the larger story scale by giving Cloud an Omni/rivaling ability before he even gets to the Gold Saucer. You know what I mean? Then again, I may have to revoke that point of praise seeing as Cloud is doing the most insane acrobatics off of chunks of buildings come the end of this game, but we'll get to that. Tifa was so much fun to play as that it's a crime that she was absent from a large chunk of game time, but getting her back with a full party in Corneo's mansion was very, very satisfying. I originally didn't gel with Barret or Aerith's playstyle at first, but once they introduced a few more fun abilities to use with them, they became much more my speed, even if Cloud and Tifa were still my go-tos. I'm sure you could make a game design lecture about how to create variety in your party members by highlighting this game's combat kits alone, never mind the written aspect of the characters attached to them. 4 party members does seem abnormally low for a full 35-hour-long game, but if you can give these most recent Final Fantasy games credit for anything, it's how each member of your party has an insanely diverse and equally compelling combat kit to learn. Materia is less fun to toy with in this game for me, but Chadley's Battle Intel side missions do a much better job soft tutorializing and helping you figure out how to get good, as it were. In the original game, I spent a lot of the playthrough not experimenting too much with materia because the UI didn't give you the best feedback as to whether or not linking 2 materia orbs would actually do something useful. This game fixes that, thankfully, but it also has helpful video playbacks demonstrating what each spell looks like, as well as what materia can be effectively linked for the best results. This is one of those things that make me not look forward to revisiting the original where none of that is present, and it also is part of what kills me about this game not replacing the original game as a definitive version. If you just made the original game's interface more clear about stuff like this, I would swoon, but that's a possibility for another timeline, I suppose. To get back on track, Chadley's missions help you find a naturally paced way to experiment with each spell and come to understand the importance of staggering, assessing, and using your weapon abilities. A soft achievement system like this was a brilliant addition to this section of the remake, and I found myself much more confident in my character builds and combat awareness in this game than I did by the end of the OG. However, I do think the game should have emphasized the shortcuts a bit more, because I had no idea how much they improved the flow of combat until around Chapter 12, but that's arguably on me for not looking at the menus thoroughly enough, so I'll give the game a pass. In spite of this superior tutorialization, the game doesn't pull its punches. The challenges presented via mandatory as well as optional bosses were very welcome additions. Leviathan kicked my ass. In fact, all of the VR summon missions did, but so did Abzu and the Type 0 Beast, as well as some of the minigames, particularly beating Jules at chin-ups. I can't remember the last time a minigame got me as tense as I get when playing the Majora's Mask shooting gallery, but as I said, this is a very welcome optional challenge. Honing back in on bosses, I had several encounters where the bosses scared the shit out of me while I was trying to figure out how to beat them. Rude honestly frightened me during my first fight, and I felt the same way about Rufus too. The ease at which they can just toss you around like a basketball just makes me feel so frail and defenseless. I loved it. Beating these two felt really satisfying because of it. Suffice it to say, I'm thrilled at the transformation combat took for this game, and I say that as someone who loved the original combat too, outside of random encounters, but you already knew that. I'm very pleased that Rebirth appears to be extrapolating off of this game by adding Chrono Trigger style team-up moves, but largely preserving what foundation they built here. I honestly forgot about what level my characters were. It was just a miscellaneous number that I saw on the save screen every now and then, and I liked not needing to worry about it. The other major chunk of gameplay this game offers you is its side quests, which I'm fairly positive about. Now, some of these are blatant fetch quests, but I will excuse a boring quest objective if the dialogue or the storyline can make me chuckle or feel something, and this game did that for almost every single quest. Yeah, fetching Betty's cats is pretty annoying, but I originally thought that all three of them were the exact same cat, so when I returned back to Betty and saw that all of them were back, I fucking laughed. Not a great quest, but stuff like that is what I'm looking for out of them. Where I found the original game managed to get you to care about Midgar through the lightning-fast pacing and sudden tragedy of Sector 7's collapse, I found that I cared about Midgar in this remake because I spent so much time helping the local residents. You feel much more like a part of this world, a member of a community, because you're helping out residents who clearly don't have the same time or resources that Avalanche does. They're out here trying to pay the bills, you go and take care of the monsters in the graveyard. Playing this game made me appreciate what Torna was going for a lot more in that respect. I like cheering people up with the jukebox in Wall Market, not just because this old man made me start crying with laughter, but because I appreciate how lifting people's morale is treated as a crucial task too. That, and I love that claiming Don Corneo's stash of gold was able to go towards rebuilding Sector 7. It felt great to have some means to undo the damage done by Shinra through these quests. Staying true to the original Final Fantasy VII experience, these quests are also a viable excuse to get you to play some minigames to balance out the grim reality you spend so much time in. After all that strife, and not of the Cloud variety, it's nice to just unload all your pent-up anger and frustration on some stupid-ass boxes, or to dance and defy gender roles. Untrue to the original spirit of Final Fantasy VII, however, is that all of these minigames actually feel polished and extremely well put together. I don't have much more to add, I just appreciate how the game managed to keep that spirit and character of the original game intact. Seeing Cloud breaking it down was also so fucking funny, by the way. Unfortunately, the actual proper character I think this remake does the dirtiest was probably the one that many people remember the original game for, Sephiroth. First of all, whatever is going on with that time travel or parallel reality shit, not going into any of that, but I think the extent to which his presence in this remake was increased significantly weakens him as a villain for this saga. Almost anyone who loves Final Fantasy VII could tell you that Sephiroth was so terrifying because you rarely ever got to see him. He was this untouchable entity you only got glimpses of throughout the beginning of the game, and otherwise you had to hear what he was like from NPCs. The most important thing about that though is, whenever you did get to see him, he was almost always doing something intimidating or mysterious at best, and heartbreaking at worst. There always appeared to be some purpose to what he was doing, even if you couldn't really make out what it was at the time. Moreover, you were really only chasing his clones for most of the game. Once you got to the real deal, he's got more power than you could possibly fathom by that point. He's built up for an entire sprawling, enormous, and emotionally devastating game, which is one of a few reasons, besides One Winged Angel, why Safer Sephiroth is a contender for one of the best final bosses in gaming history. This rendition of Sephiroth spits directly in the face of nearly all of that, unfortunately. Sephiroth, in this game, regularly appears to make Cloud have some Genova episodes, and reminds Cloud that he is, in fact, the villain of this story. Whenever he isn't doing that, he's showing up in areas that don't really need him to be there, and completely drains the mysterious and intimidating aspect of him in the original when he regularly appears to do absolutely nothing. He seems closer on the sliding scale to a high school bully who teases you in the hallway instead of a godly being born from an alien genetic experiment who has killed or is going to kill nearly everyone you love. Then he ends up being the final boss of this Midgar portion of the remake, despite only actually being important to the last fourth of it, somehow riding this perfect line of being an unfitting villain for the finale of this game, but simultaneously blowing the effect of waiting for the end of the whole story to finally beat this asshole for everything that he did to you. Since we only cover the events of Midgar in this game, you only get brief glimpses of what Sephiroth did to Cloud, Tifa, and all of Niflheim. That's not nothing, but the lack of further detail within this game makes it hard to remember that that's what Sephiroth is so infamous for, when most of what you've seen him do in this game consisted of goofing around and talking seductively to Cloud. No matter how you slice it, I can't see a way that this rendition of the character will be anywhere near as satisfying to beat as he was back in the OG. We already are fighting him at the edge of time and space before we've even unlocked the ability to ride chocobos. You're basically just doing safer Sephiroth already by this point. Now, I get it, right? That's part of what the game is saying. This isn't anything like what Sephiroth did in the original game. He's defying fate. Who knows what's going to happen next? And hey, you want to know something? I personally am not opposed to this idea of a remake project where everyone can experience a brand new story. But I ask you this. Is it an inherently good change to have Sephiroth randomly pop in and remind everyone that he's the bad guy in place of the unsettling lack of presence he had in the original? What makes this version of the character engaging or memorable in the way he was back in 1997? I'm not averse to changes, but I just can't get behind this version of the character in comparison to the original's rendition of him. Now, it does make sense why he shows up to bother Cloud to get him to drive off the Fate Ghosts, but I also ask you, how could the stakes possibly level themselves back out in a natural way after all of this moon jumping, building slashing, and fate-defying bullshit? How in the hell do you transition back to the local ranch to raise some chocobos after you just destroyed the shackles of destiny? That's another thing too. I'm not trying to say this in bad faith, but I do think the whispers and what the characters say about them can come off a bit mean-spirited towards the people who wanted this game to be a genuine, faithful remake. The whispers are a very clear analog to the fans who were expecting as such, either that or a personification of what is expected of remakes, and at times it sounds like the game is dissing its own source material in an attempt to express how it wants to take the story in a new direction. We have to defeat the Whispers, who want the game to play out like the original Final Fantasy VII. Never mind the fact that they save Barret from a fatal stab or anything, it's not like there could be more of a gray area in this conflict that we could display. No, we don't want things to play out like they do in that timeline. Oh? But why? I liked that timeline where the world survives Meteor. It's a story very dear to many, myself included now. Couldn't you have found a different way to say this? Again, I don't say this to imply the developers had some sort of malicious intent behind this idea, but can you really blame anyone for not being stoked about all of this? I think a lot of the best parts of this game are things that were lifted straight out of the original, but this time the moments often land much better and hit much harder. I thought Barret's breakdown after Sector 7 collapsed in the original game was one of the moments that was held back the most by the script being awkwardly translated. The reaction Barret has in this game, it made me cry. John Eric Bentley's shrieks reverberated in my ears for hours after the fact, and it made Barret my favorite character in this game just behind Cloud. Sure, the dialogue is different, but that moment and what it means for the larger story is unchanged. Isn't that a clear example of staying on course with Destiny helping to improve the original experience? Why is that portrayed at the end of this story as an almost unanimously bad thing, something to be overcome and defeated? Again, changes aren't inherently bad, nor are they inherently good. I don't want the devs to shy away from making what they want to make, but I think stuff like the Whispers can give off a very bad impression. I suppose the whole thing is this. I feel like even the die-hard fans of this game can recognize that this whole thing could crash and burn in future parts, and that's assuming you don't think it already did by the end of this game. As the game itself puts it, we're now flying in the realms of boundless, terrifying freedom, and that's clearly not everybody's thing. I'll always respect when developers are given the opportunity to experiment on a scale this large. From the outside looking in, it looks like they're making the game it appears they want to make instead of the game the shareholders want them to make, and I'm so down for that. Because don't get me wrong, I am very cautiously looking forward to what's going to happen in future parts, but I also can't say I've been so excited to see the direction a AAA franchise could take quite like this. For better and worse, I am absolutely hooked on this story, and if the ending of this game could manage to surprise me as much as it did, I see no reason the future entries couldn't do the same thing, so we'll just have to wait and see. It's as the old line goes, there ain't no getting off of this train. Oh boy, did I say the last one was a doozy? I don't even know how to begin with this one. Final Fantasy XVI, by the time this comes out, just finally released, marking 7 years since the last original numbered Final Fantasy game. I get it, turning 16 is a big deal. You don't want them to leave the nest so soon, you know? From what I've seen, 15 is not one of the more favored entries in the franchise, but it doesn't seem as infamous as titles like Final Fantasy II or Final Fantasy XIII, from what I've seen anyway. And seeing as I'm the last person whose opinion should matter on this subject at all, I figured, well, obviously this is the subject to end the video off on. This game is pretty notoriously one of the most troubled installments of the Final Fantasy franchise, with the history of its development getting its own dedicated Wikipedia page. Originally a spin-off game directed by Tetsuya Nomura known as Final Fantasy Versus 13, the Final Fantasy 15 that we know today faced practically every stage of development hell. There eventually was a hardcore shift from the Versus 13 project that started in 2006 and was being worked on up until 2012, when then the game was being officially developed as Final Fantasy 15 proper. Meaning that, not including the time spent making the DLC after the game's release, some of the members of the staff were working on this game, or something close to it, for 10 years. Over the course of the project, Nomura went from being the director, then to co-director, then to no director so he could go work on Kingdom Hearts 3. The aforementioned DLC was being created to, and I quote, make sure that fans who bought the game and played it feel like they've made a great purchase. And to smush a cherry on top of all of this chicanery, a significant portion of the second wave of DLC was cancelled. That last bit may be something of a blessing in disguise, seeing as it looked like it would completely undo the ending, which I see as the best part of the game, but it still goes to show that this whole project experienced many setbacks. If there was a checklist of problems that you could throw at a staff of game developers, I think this game gets an A for nearly full completion. What the fuck? It's no surprise then that this is a somewhat contentious entry, from what I've seen, anyway. Out of all 9 of the games that I've talked about here today, this is the one that I feel the most intense feelings about. I truly am conflicted with how much I love this game, because it feels like the game meanders from being everything I would want modern Final Fantasy to become, and then turning around and butchering the aspects that the older titles nailed pretty gracefully. It feels like 3 steps forward but another 2 steps back, except all of the steps are happening at the same time instead of a clean 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, if that makes any sense. Let's start with the good stuff, because there is a lot of it to go around. What I think is the strongest aspect of this game, by far, is your party of Backstreet Boys. In Final Fantasy games, and hell, most RPGs, you get a full ensemble cast made up of the standard likable or relatable character archetypes. You usually get around 6 to 8 members to use, but somewhere along the way you begin to notice that at least one member feels like they're just kind of along for the ride or otherwise have very little reason to continue being a part of this story. Not necessarily a bad character, but you sort of get the sense that there's little reason for some of your party members to stick around. This game makes, in my opinion, a refreshing move of starting you off with your full party at the beginning of the game and then tethers you to their bond as a group of friends. Initially, this does seem like it would sacrifice your emotional investment in the game's world building. In a lot of these games, you connect with individuals with vastly varying life experiences who often exist to help flesh out the world's numerous cultures. Everyone in 15's party is from the same city, and you don't get the same common dynamic with all these characters from all different walks of life. If you wanted to characterize it simply, you could boil down the whole game to saying that it's just some dudes going on a road trip. I understand that the original setup put greater emphasis on Final Fantasy's overarching idea of people of all different kinds uniting to overcome the greatest evils in our world, and I have to agree it does feel less powerful when your crew has been friends for years before the game even begins. That said, I think taking that core theme and focusing it on a group of friends, people who already love each other and want the best for each other, and diving further inwards and straining those relationships instead of expanding outwards by adding new party members, I found it to be an incredibly welcome change. I have never been more sold on a party's bond. I can see and understand how and why, no matter what happens, these guys would die for each other. Even if Gladio and Ignis are bound by royal oath to stand by and protect Noctis, you get the idea that there's more to it than that. They both genuinely care about the guy. I think this is no better represented than by the DLC expansions dedicated to each member of the party other than Noctis. Each of these campaigns highlights a greater part of the party's backstory and more or less exists to further cement their resolve to protect their brothers in arms at any cost. If you know anything about me, you know that little things like seeing vignettes at every diner or campsite, promptly taking photos throughout your day, hearing your party converse about even the magazines you observe on a bench, and of course the party commenting on stuff like how hot it is outside, or how you're being a dickhead for summoning or swinging your weapons at them while you're traversing, or discussing an aspect of a quest that you just completed. This is the shit about video games that I love. This is what party members in RPGs should always have. This is what you should have had, Torna. You have one of the coolest casts of characters sitting at your fingertips, and all you could show them doing at the campsites is sitting deadpan and motionless in front of a fire. Come on. These guys talk to each other like people. Noctis may be a prince, and the game emphasizes that he can't just pretend he's any old guy in the world and waste the sacrifices of the people who have gotten him to where he is now. But on the open road, he's still one of the boys, baby, and he acts like one of them too. The way they joke with each other, the rapport, it's just absolutely delightful. I think the opening bit of gameplay is a great litmus test of if you'll enjoy this game as a whole. I find that whether or not you'll walk away liking this game is heavily contingent on how much you enjoy seeing these guys shooting the shit and bonding like it's a coming-of-age movie. When the game ends, it flashes back to the night before you return to Insomnia, and you see Noctis telling his friends how much it hurts him knowing that he has to say goodbye to them, and man, is it hard to watch. It's fair to say that I had a lot of stories to absorb during the process of making this long-ass video. I think it has to count for something that this, right here, is my favorite scene in any one of these games. After 350 odd hours of playing and recording, this scene, the one that ended my journey through all of these wonderful experiences, was my favorite one. The fact that it lets you just sit in silence and listen to a man break down, attempting to put into words how much he loves his friends, trying to find a way to convey to them what they mean to him, it fucks me up. In spite of 15's narrative faults, this dynamic drives this entire game for me, because even if these guys aren't incredibly developed when you're just experiencing the main story, the simple fact is the game succeeds at getting me to love seeing them together and doing these things. Most of my favorite memories with this game were formed just screwing around in the open world. Obligatory, the game looks beautiful, especially on PC, comment here. The landscapes are vast and full of unique environments to traverse. Lakes, rivers, deserts, canyons, winding hills, beaches, forests, and good old American roadways. The most unrealistic aspect of this game that seems pretty American, for lack of a better term, and how the world is stylized, is that the drivers on the road aren't goddamn psychopaths and they yield to pedestrians, huh? It's almost like you could leave on time or maybe early and you wouldn't need to rush. This really is a fantasy game. I dare say my immersion's being suspended here. This variety of vistas is also helped by the continuous day and night cycle, mixing with the advanced lighting engine and skyboxes to bring enormous contrast to an environment over the course of just a few in-game hours. Aside from the hunting missions that require you to hunt at night and endure Ignis's routine, how many drinks have you had? Is it safe for you to drive? I've come up with a new recipe. Can't wait to try it. I kind of enjoyed that doing things at night is advised against. For the gameplay, I like this because the lighting is so advanced that exploring at night is pretty aimless and kind of feels shitty, but the environment is also being overrun by demons who serve a gameplay role that aligns with their presence in the overarching story. Whenever you see one of these dudes rising out of the ground, you know it's time to crawl back to a diner or put up a tent because they are way stronger than anything else you'll run into. Or you could be a stubborn bastard like myself and brute force one or two of them.
This sounds like you're having fun.
I also just love the bit of world building where demons only come out at night because light hurts them. Just straight up vitamin D or even electrical light hurts these guys. I also like that you can see the settlements put up these giant Colosseum lights to defend against them at night. It admittedly doesn't seem like the most ironclad defense, but hey, they're comfortable with this setup, who am I to judge? It heightens the severity of the stakes at the endgame when you realize that those brief periods where you would hurriedly run back to safety has been the reality for Eos for a decade. I do think this effect would be further heightened if the back half of this game wasn't so railroaded that you'd actually remember that the game was pretty open-ended and let you explore new places before Chapter 9 ends, but I am getting way ahead of myself here. While I'm alluding to discussing the game's pacing, the first half of 15, where you just get to goof around and explore some beautiful places and fight some monsters, I think is the most enjoyable part. I found it fascinating how even some of the most menial stuff in 15 is some of the stuff I had the most fun doing. I'm not trying to say that as a backhanded compliment, by the way. I just genuinely found the stuff that sounds boring on paper to be really fun. Riding chocobos, hunting Deadeye, listening to Final Fantasy music in the Regalia, hunting for dog tags and clearing bounties. The core game loop in 15 is very engaging, and while the combat can feel mindless at points, it's still fast-paced and it manages to be exciting and keeps me immersed. Despite this video having nearly been done with my desperate desire to simply get it out there already growing stronger and stronger, I still wasn't able to stop enjoying this game's wealth of side activities. Fishing, taking photos with Prompto, or hunting for ingredients for Ignis to cook up another mouth-watering masterpiece. I spent the first 10 to 12 hours of this game doing all of these things, and I think it's the most consistently fun Final Fantasy game in terms of core gameplay that I've played. Again, I loved these other games, but 15 doesn't really have any gameplay holdups in the overworld like these ones did for me. The most I can say is that it just takes a while to get anywhere on foot, but even then your mobility options at the ready are pretty solid for most situations you would find yourself in. If Xenoblade had movement options like these, I wouldn't have any complaints about the comparatively boring traversal in those games. The devs of 15 knew how fun it can be to just roll around like a dumbass. Also, as an aside, I greatly appreciate that you can use your parked car as a fast travel point. It's an incredibly useful feature. Again, Xenoblade, you should take some fucking notes. 15 is an incredibly fun game to play, outside of Chapter 13, of course. There were no random encounters to jump on top of you to rigidly jerk you from exploring to fighting whenever you didn't want to. The warp ability made traversal a lot of fun, the controls are fluid, and the journey you take to level yourself up feels as non-linear as you can reasonably get away with. My biggest issue here is that the game was equally, if not more guilty as Final Fantasy VII Remake when it makes you do the sidle along a wall for 45 minutes or slowly trail behind this guy for a year kind of gameplay. That, and I didn't find many side quests I would consider above the quality standard of okay. The only real, I wouldn't even really call it a holdup, but trade-off with the open world is that your map shows you just about all of the content to engage with, taking some of the joy of discovering something away when you're just following the circle in the corner. Even calling it a trade-off is, I guess, kind of a misnomer, because if you wanted to engage solely with the world with no outside help, then you could avoid talking to the tipsters in each town or just turn the minimap off if you so choose. I don't know. After playing Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, I just don't find the same feeling behind how exciting it is to discover things as it is in those games. That said, people like me who also hate getting lost and sometimes just want to be led to the content can save time without wandering for ages, so talk about a non-complaint. Once again, I found it impressive how much fun it was to do even the most generic of quest types. Hunting for hordes of enemies was surprisingly really fun. I was low on money for this entire game, partially because I liked funneling a lot of what I earned into ingredients for Ignis's meals. By the way, that is some of the best looking food I've ever seen. Holy shit, I need some of that in my mouth right now. Sorry. It made the often meaningless incentive for quests like these of earning money and finding ingredients actually feel like a reward. Hitting 10,000 gil was something of a milestone in a way that it just isn't in any of these other games. Something about the way the game frames it with these wanted posters, and the fact that it almost always coincided with my desire to explore the surrounding area made a completely generic quest feel like a reward every single time, especially by the time you get to Chapter 3. Riding chocobos feels like a goddamn joyride in this game. I love being able to see all your boys riding their own birds, and you didn't hear it from me, but this is the best chocobo riding theme rendition. After the session where I unlocked chocobos, I got excited just thinking about playing more just to fart around with them. On a whim, I looked up whether or not you could name them as you could in Final Fantasy VII, and not only can you do that, but you can also dye their feathers and deck them out with medals from the races. As soon as I saw that, I got right the fuck back on the game and did that first thing. Any complaints I could make about the world feeling a little bit empty are Thanos snapped away by being able to ride and jump around with your own chocobo. This really did make me feel like a kid again. While I wouldn't call combat in 15 perfect by any stretch, I do think it is engaging consistently, and like Xenoblade, is great at keeping you immersed by way of not needing to load into a different screen for battles, and in a way uses combat as a reward for thorough exploration. Even if you aren't asked to do all that much critical thinking, there is a simple joy to seeing Noctis fly around and jump while elegantly slashing enemies. You essentially alternate back and forth between holding square to defend and dodge, and attacking with circle, and or calling one of your allies for a special move with L1. You can, more or less, just hold down the circle button and occasionally spin the analog stick, and Noctis will do most of the combo for you, so long as you're targeting an enemy. It's a real turn the brain off kind of flow state, which isn't always a bad thing, mind you, but it does leave something to be desired when it comes to the action side of the combat. You can also switch to your other lads mid-battle if you unlock the ability to do so in the Ascension trees, and each of them plays radically different from Noctis thanks to these fellas getting their own DLC toolkits. Gladio plays a bit more like a traditional action game character with a standard sword and shield setup. He has a more demanding dodge and parry system and much longer attack animations, requiring you to be more cautious but rewarding you with much stronger attacks. Prompto gets a trio of firearms and a grenade and plays like a third-person shooter character. You get a chance to fight at a distance and go crazy. It's pretty fun, especially during episode Prompto. Finally, Ignis gets a trio of elemental daggers that excel depending on the lineup of enemies you're up against. His combat feels the most satisfying to me out of the trio of friends. I love the fluidity of his combos and how quickly he builds up his tech bar and his total clarity special moves. While we're talking about some of the more basic combat mechanics, targeting in this game is kind of uncomfortable because you either have to hold down the R1 button the entire time you're facing a group of enemies if you want to stay focused on the action, or you can hold R1 and click in the right stick. However, if you move the camera at all, you'll be swapped onto some other enemy, which will happen because enemies dart around the screen like children on a sugar high in this game. There are some battles where you will just be completely lost as to what's going on, and in this way, I'm thankful the game doesn't require intense mechanical mastery from you, because experiencing this would just make me angry in that case. Although the one place I think this game should have been more mechanically demanding is in its parrying system. Every game that I've played with a parry mechanic in it gives you a strict window of time where you can negate any damage and counter the enemy, and it's always one of the most rewarding feelings to get down in a game. It requires you to learn the enemy's animation patterns, as well as your character's delay for swinging their shield or whatever it is you're parrying with. But most importantly, it's almost always an alternative to blocking the enemy and eating a fraction of the damage you would if you miss your parry or just eat the hit flat out. 15, or at least base game 15, differs greatly from this because as long as you're holding down the block button as Noctis, you'll either evade or parry most attacks that enemies throw at you, with your MP being the only real limitation. And it never feels that good to pull off a counterattack when it's so easy. Not even that, but you don't even need to be facing an enemy in order to parry them. You could be bent over tying your shoe, and as long as you've got the square button held down, well hey, you're good to go, Noctis. That, and you will never lose a battle so long as you have items or a teammate nearby to revive you. It will never happen. Although I do love the fact that potions are changed to heal half of your HP so they don't immediately lose any chance of being viable after the early game. That was a great change. Even if the double health bar thing this game has going on is really weird. The expansions do fix the parrying problems I have, but when they're each about 1 hour long and don't carry those changes over to the base game for your main character, it's a bit too little too late. That said, I have to give kudos to whoever came up with the point warp ability because that always felt great to use for traversal as well as just hitting enemies with a
surprise, motherfucker
attack. Battling feels good to take part in, but it doesn't often demand a lot from you, which again, could be a good thing depending on who you ask. Sometimes it can be nice to just watch some fun stuff happen on screen. I think my feelings on this are best represented in the onslaught of Uncharted-esque set pieces like the Leviathan battle in Chapter 9 and the train set piece in Chapter 10. Both of these battles cracked a big-ass smile on my face. The scale is off the charts, the music is operatic and chilling, the sound design is perfect, and it's still a lot of fun despite the fact that all the game is really demanding of you is that you point warp and hold circle. If you have an affinity for larger-than-life battles with some kick-ass finishers, I think you'll find a lot to appreciate here. There's also the soundtrack, whose primary composer is Yoko Shimomura this time around. For the tracks she didn't compose, she was seated alongside numerous other legendary composing talents. I talked about Mitsuda and Uematsu being a dynamic duo for Chrono Trigger's soundtrack, but this is like the Avengers lineup of composers. I was somewhat hesitant that Uematsu wasn't the primary composer this time around, but then noticed that, Kingdom Hearts aside, Yoko Shimomura has already played a huge part in creating some of my favorite soundtracks out there, and I just somehow didn't notice it. Any chance the music would be just okay was immediately decimated. Do you want to know when I could tell? The damn title screen. Whatever emotion a scene or a set piece or an environment calls for, she knows how to crank it up to 11. I think she and her crew particularly killed it with the more serene tracks. This game has some of the most relaxing pieces of music I have ever heard. I'm surprised I didn't see any sleep guides in my YouTube recommendations featuring this soundtrack because it seems tailor-made for something like that. You've got Relax and Reflect, Lestalem, Cape Cayam, Sunset Waltz, and Golden Key. Then for the Blood Pumpers, you have Up for the Challenge, the Imperial Boss Battle theme, and Episode Ignis's Battle theme. Oh my god, dude! Has it been pleasant so far, this section of the video? Just a nice blanket of positivity and praise for the hard work put in by hundreds of talented developers who went through hell to make this game what it is today. A feat that I hope I'm accurately communicating my respect for. I'm sorry to say that what comes next will be a far cry from that, tonally speaking. Unfortunately, the aspect of Final Fantasy XV that leaves the most to be desired for me by far is its story, and I doubt that's a surprise to many people who have played this game to the end, because if you know, you know. I'm going to start with the complaint that I blame myself for, partly, and that's that I feel like this game's diction is just too advanced for my baby brain. Again, not trying to say the game is completely to blame here, but I found myself getting lost during a lot of major scenes. Especially with the 6 astrals who speak in the most medieval way imaginable. When your party of bros talks colloquially and in just regular human speech, it feels like complete whiplash in the opposite direction when one of these dudes showed up to tell me about the providence of the king and whatnot. This is compounded by this game's affinity for introducing and killing off characters seemingly by the will of a slot machine. It led to a lot of moments where exposition and dialogue was just going in one ear and then being spit out of the other. I similarly felt that the number of factions or kingdoms or people were introduced and thrown around like a frisbee seemingly out of nowhere. It led to more scenes where I just felt completely lost as to who was being spoken about or what role they played in the plot. I grasped basic things, like I could tell Arden is the bad guy, Noctis is the chosen king, he has to get the royal arms, Regis was his dad and Lunafreya is his bride-to-be, but once they started talking about members of the Empire, whom you rarely personally interact with at all, I just completely blanked out. I feel like the rate at which these concepts and characters are thrown at you can be overwhelming, but again, maybe it is just a me thing. Bear in mind that it also took 27 hours for me to remember that this game has the archives menu to help you keep track of things like that. There were also some moments I'm glad none of you will get to see the full duration of, like how when I fought Cerberus, I was too wrapped up in the thing's attack cycle to pay attention to Ignis blatantly telling me how to beat the boss. So I just ended up taking an ass beating for 14 minutes before realizing, holy shit, I could have just point warped to him when he leaps up. Again, not gonna pretend the game was to blame for most of that. Beyond that, there are numerous weird story decisions that I truly do not comprehend the logic behind. For example, the attack on Insomnia, the catalyst for Noctis' true journey and the story's best opportunity to get you to hate the Niflheim Empire, is only shown using footage from the Kingsglaive Final Fantasy XV movie with no sound effects or voice lines. It just feels awkward instead of being the heartbreaking kick into gear that this story needs. This footage features numerous characters you've never seen before, locations you've never seen before, which is most of Insomnia, and enemy forces you will never run into. I don't know if this was a result of budget constraints or what, but hey, Square Enix, of all the scenes to allow your developers to splurge a little bit over budget, I think it should have been the inciting incident of your story. It's never ideal, but you can usually excuse a half-baked story in an open world game because what you tend to get in return is an expansive world with tons of other things to do that lets you make your own stories. Telling a linear and well-paced narrative in a game that is telling you to do whatever you want whenever you want is barely possible unless you heavily restrict what the player is able to do, which goes against everything an open world game in theory is trying to achieve. 15 attempts to balance these two things out in a way that I can definitely respect, and I can see the game's approach working well in concept. The second half of this game is essentially all story, set pieces, and hallways compared to the almost completely open, free-roaming, and chillax first half. That's not such a bad thing on paper. It allows the story to hold more prominence, which I think the game did need, but it also feels like too little too late. When your story decides to kick into gear halfway through a game, there's just not enough time to make up for what was nearly absent from the first half. That, and they needed to justify your ability to go back into the open world by having you go back in time via Umbra at a resting point. I also don't think you can excuse the game's story for being half-baked because the second half of this game's story almost feels like it wants to get itself over with despite its prominence in the game increasing tenfold. There are numerous huge developments that don't feel as though they got the appropriate amount of time or explanation devoted to them. There are major components of the friend group's character development and plot relevance being left out of the main story. That is, unless you got the DLC, which feels incredibly scummy, even if all the expansions are a lot of fun for how short they are, and even if I do like the overall story told with all of those expansions there to properly flesh out these characters. All of the developments made in these DLC expansions feel too significant for these guys to not mention to the player in the main story. Sure, in episode Gladiolus, they show you a campfire scene where he tells the boys what happened, but how do you return to your friends with a giant scar on your face and only have them ask about it once you've sat down to camp for the night? Yeah, so that's how I defeated the Blade Master. Like, what the hell? Wouldn't you be just a little more stoked about surpassing a holy trial of Gilgamesh in these decades-old tempering grounds? It just feels so jarring. Prompto has something of an existential crisis and doubts whether his friends really want or need him to be around. But all of that gets summarized into 2 sentences worth of dialogue when you reunite with him in the main story. DLC, I think, is something of a slippery slope, but I don't think it's a lot to ask that its existence isn't justified as a way to fix something in a game's story, at least not DLC that you have to pay extra money for. At the risk of being an even more broken record than I already am, I could play Xenoblades 1, 2, and 3, mostly, and not need to play the DLC expansions to have a more than satisfying story and developed cast of characters that never leave my head. Each of those extra campaigns adds to the original world and story and makes mechanical adjustments, but they aren't remedies for what's already been written. I think it would be disrespectful to insinuate that the developers behind one of the most historic and beloved RPG franchises on the planet couldn't meet that standard. But something also tells me that fault doesn't fully lie on the devs when it comes to how half-baked this base game turned out in some regards. I found that the most distracting of the DLC's character gaps was for Ignis. His loss of eyesight is a gravely important development in the story that challenges the whole party and strains Gladio and Noctis' relationship a lot. This is one of my favorite developments in this game. It's the first time I've seen a game make one of your party members face a physical disability and actually go the distance to demonstrate just how shitty it would be to suffer something like losing your ability to see. The party is trying to accommodate and make sure that Ignis is up to it, but you can tell that he feels he's holding them all back. If I were in Ignis' shoes, I could see myself thinking the exact same way. It really makes you feel for the guy. It also convinces you how much Ignis cares about Noctis when you watch it play out in his DLC campaign. The scene on the train where Gladio and Noctis fight I thought was great, but I also think it's significantly better when you have the essential context detailing how and why Ignis lost his eyesight. It's not a plot point you can hand-wave in my opinion, because even if Noctis was dealing with an enormous heartbreaking revelation, him not asking Ignis at some point on screen what happened to you feels incredibly unnatural. I get that the story's trying to drive home that Noctis is being a little bit self-centered when he has to step into the role of being a king, but this is a shocking injury for him to just not ask Ignis about at all. Even if he figures Ignis doesn't want to talk about it, wouldn't Gladio or Prompto have some questions too? Ignis seems emotionally secure enough to be able to offer them just a brief explanation of what happened. Even if it's implied that Noctis asked off-screen, I mean to argue it's more important that the player knows how and why Ignis lost his eyesight. This is another one of those small things that drives me nuts, but indulge me for a minute. Not telling the audience in the main story why Ignis lost his eyesight takes away from Gladio's point a bit when you aren't aware of the fact that Ignis had to hurt himself to save Noctis. Gladio makes it a point to say Ignis took one for you too, and for what? But it's incredibly unclear what Ignis would have had to do to help Noctis that resulted in him losing his eyesight of all things. Ignis could have suffered a random accident, or he could have made a deliberate sacrifice, and you're just supposed to guess what happened, and I just don't think that works here. In a set piece where chunks of buildings are flying around like it's the inside of the tornado in The Wizard of Oz, nobody would be able to speculate that Ignis made the selfless move of grabbing the Ring of the Lucii to save Noctis and ended up losing his eyesight because of it. I don't think it's fair for the game to expect the audience to fill in the gaps like that for such a major development. Gladio talks to Noctis multiple times before this point about how the king can't let his people sacrifice themselves for him just to decide to throw in the towel because he isn't feeling up to it. It would have made the moment and his point hit harder if we had even a brief conversation where Ignis explains what happened, because it would feel more justified for Gladio to get so pissed off. When you watch the scene devoid of that bit of context, it kind of feels like Gladio's being apathetic to Noctis. I get it's a grim situation and nobody is definitively correct here, which is why Ignis steps in later, but it's distracting how such a major character beat was just not properly conveyed at all in the original game's story. It's also awkward finding the right time to play the DLC stories to get filled in on some of those details, especially in the case of episode Ignis, which outright spoils the endgame twist that Noctis has to sacrifice himself to save Eos. Thanks for that. It makes a game that was in development for such a long time still somehow feel like it was released undercooked before patching new things in to make sure that fans who bought the game and played it feel like they've made a great purchase. But by far my biggest hang up with the narrative is how many relationships the game clearly wants you to care about without earning it. It's not just a problem with side characters, I feel this way about multiple of the hugely important characters too. Don't mistake me, I'm not happy that Regis gets killed by the Empire, But I'm not really sad either, because there was so little going on in that relationship before he died that I was just kind of like, darn, that sucks, that blasted Niflheim Empire. I connected more with Cor as a mentor than I ever did with Regis as a father because, get this, you actually get to form a bond with Cor over the course of the story. The course of the story. You know what, I shouldn't be allowed to speak. That's a recurring theme you'll come to notice in this game. Most of the characters that you're told to care about, you'll really only have a reason to care about when it's basically too late. You motherfuckers. Not Jared! No, not Jared. I cared so much about that guy that you have like 2 conversations with. Oh. I hate to say it, but nowhere is this more evident than with my girl Luna Freya. Dog, this is the main love interest, and for the life of me, I could not tell you what she and Noctis like about each other, besides the fact that they grew up together and they were already friends. You start to get a vague idea when she gives her speech in Altissia. I thought that was a great moment. But then she's dead, and again, I just didn't have enough there to get sad about for longer than 30 seconds. Getting invested in her character after the events of Altissia just seems like too little too late. Again, Noctis and Luna's relationship is just hampered by so many little things. Lots of little stuff, like them only contacting each other via the journal attached to Umbra and his magical nose. I get it's romantic and sentimental and supposedly secret, but they also live in a society where they can regularly make phone calls and text everybody else in their lives. Oh, but what if the Niflheim Empire hacks one of their phones? Get one cybersecurity major to hook up the future king and his bride-to-be with a secure network or a VPN or something. Especially during a time when the Niflheim Empire would readily capture or kill either of them, why would you decide to make your communication with your future wife so arduous? Look, I love dogs as much as the next guy, but you can't tell me that this is the most efficient way to get these two in touch with each other. Come on. Why should the 2 most important people in Eos, people who are crucial to this world's survival and prosperity, have to go through a bunch of, I heard from a guy who knows another guy that Lady Luna Freya is gonna be, stop! Just text her! What are you doing, Noctis? Bro is destined to be married to her and he still can't get her number. Come on, man. This isn't feeling like a Final Fantasy anymore. This feels like an accurate reality. And I don't need any further reminders that I'm chronically single. The story shows a lot of emotional scenes displaying Luna yearning to see Noctis and regretting the fate that they both share. But almost all of the best scenes with her are shown to you, say it with me now, after she's dead. I feel like the story could have used that tragic separation of these 2 characters to make this relationship work so much better. Get us to want to see these 2 characters together. Tell, or better yet, show us smaller and more intimate details about what they like about each other. Stuff like, are either of them picky eaters? Noctis is, so how does Luna Freya feel about that? Do they share a hobby? Is there a possibility we could see them doing anything other than sitting down on a bed and reading some shit? They're children! Show them playing or seeing the sights, or show Noctis and her fishing or frolicking through a field of the fucking Scylla blossoms that you want us to know about. You can't just sit the 2 of them down in a room together, exposit on some random stuff, and then turn around and go, wow, look at what a deep connection they have. No, I'm sorry, you need more than that. To beat the living shit out of the dead horse yet again, even the least interesting Xenoblade romance soars above this, and I would say the same thing about Final Fantasy VII and especially Final Fantasy IX's romance. Far be it from me to tell a staff of AAA developers how to tell their story, right? I've never made a game worth talking about, and I certainly don't know the full extent of the obstacles in the way of the developers when making this game. I hope it doesn't sound like I believe I know better than anyone, but I would like to know whether they had more interesting scenes with these 2 planned that ended up getting cut or something, because what we do have feels like the table scraps of a much more interesting or dynamic relationship. I'm not a person who generally likes to put on my nitpicking glasses trying to poke holes in stories. So long as you can get me emotionally invested and you can maintain a more or less believable and logically constructed world, that's all I really care about at the end of the day. I am more than willing to let some plot gaps or inconsistencies fall to the wayside if the story is emotionally engaging me. However, I feel as though whenever I tried to find meaning in some of this game's best moments, or thought more about moments I wanted to enjoy more, it didn't take a lot for me to ask more unanswered questions or find more things to be dissatisfied with. Having said all of this, I do think there are still really strong narrative beats in this game. Arden is a pretty delightful villain. Darren DePaul's voice work is easily my favorite performance in the game, a delicate balancing act between being insidious and cocky. It makes sense for him to be that way. He is immortal, after all. His backstory is incredibly compelling once you learn about it, especially if you play episode Arden. Even if the rest of the villains are forgettable, Arden certainly isn't, and I think his plan of leading Noctis to the crystal was pretty well handled. Whenever he comes around to bother the shit out of you or send you somewhere, it's actually relevant. I feel like whenever villains show up this frequently, I always kind of go, man, don't you have anything better to do? But in this case, it actually fully makes sense. For one thing, the dude's incapable of dying. He really is here just to fuck around with Noctis to try and find some sense of redemption, and just about all of what he does is crucial to set up his plan to direct Noctis into taking a 10-year-long nap. I really like Arden's outfit too. I don't know, I just love his hat and how he gestures with it. His theme is excellent too. I also love that your final battle and dungeon bring you right back to where you started, but this time in a world that hasn't seen the sun come up for 10 years. I absolutely love when stuff comes full circle in that way. I similarly loved Noctis by the end, as occasionally awkward as he can come off sometimes. He is thrust into this position that nobody in Eos's history has ever put up with before, and has to shoulder the weight of the world practically on his own. His kingdom and his friends are there for him, for sure, but they can't pretend to understand exactly what he's going through. Even the Astrals were at least a group of 6 who bore similar responsibilities. Noctis, however, was groomed to be a king, the chosen one, when it seems like he just wants to be a regular guy. I get that many people sacrifice themselves for Noctis, but it hits differently when he's essentially told that if he doesn't sacrifice himself, the world will never heal. The fact is, he and Lunafreya, hell, most people in Eos didn't ask for any of what they're being told to do. Noctis doesn't seem like he even really wants to be a king, not for lack of ability or responsibility, but because it makes him and the people around him sacrifice everything. Even if it was a very clear character arc that he would accept his destiny, it still works so well because the game highlights how unfair these circumstances are. All of this was the result of what his ancestors decided to do several millennia ago. Because Somnus was just the biggest piece of shit ever, his descendants ended up needing to sacrifice their happiness. Nothing about that is fair to Arden, Regis, Lunafreya, or Noctis. And yet Noctis still puts his wants and needs aside and accepts his own death to bring the world back to order. I can't help but respect the hell out of him for that. The entire ending once you enter Insomnia's Citadel is, in pretty much every way, perfect. Say what you will about this game, but I think it 100% nailed its ending, even if several major parts of what preceded it felt undercooked. Finishing the final boss directly on the note of Noctis sacrificing himself, then rolling credits, then hitting you with the tearjerker, and finally ending on the photo you took with you into the final boss was all absolute perfection. Upon beating this game and rewatching my footage from the intro, it made me realize how much this game was absolutely great at the beginning half, was stumbling over itself for a bit later, and then composed itself and got ready to make waterfalls pour out of your eyes. Even as someone who didn't get attached to Lunafreya much at all, seeing the two of them together in the afterlife made me go, fuck yeah, you two earned that. Enjoy your eternity together. Having said all of this stuff, I think it becomes clear why the main party was my favorite aspect of this game's story, because while development-wise there are noticeable holes without the extra campaigns, as the player, I developed an attachment to everyone I traveled alongside. I care about Prompto, I care about Gladiolus, I care about Ignis, and I care about Noctis. I even liked Iris and Aranea a lot too. They were great companion characters to have traveling with you. They were there to converse about the insane situation they found themselves in. They were there camping with me. They were there to pose in photos to reminisce on when the day was past us. They were there with me through all of it. And it's why these moments stuck with me, while these ones passed me by. This is why I firmly believe that if this dynamic, if this aspect of the game doesn't grab you, I don't imagine you would have enjoyed this game very much. I sympathize with the developers a lot on this one because it seems apparent that as soon as the ship set sail, it sprung a leak, and then as soon as that one was repaired, another 2 took its place. I hope none of what I say here presents some idea that they ought to have done better under the circumstances. In spite of all my conflicting feelings, the fact is, I still had a great time with the game. The world is a lot of fun to explore, riding chocobos made me feel like a kid again, the grandiose set pieces were wonderful, the music kicks ass and I want Yoko Shimomura to make every video game soundtrack that I hear from this point forward, and I was grateful that these goobers were with me through it all. Here's hoping that Final Fantasy XVI was granted a healthy development cycle. Because if Square could manage to get this much right in a game that was on fire for most of its development, there's no doubt they could blow everyone's hair back with the proper amount of time. And judging by the reception I've seen thus far, it looks like they're doing just that. Here's hoping it comes out on PC soon, because I still don't have a PlayStation 5. So, many hours of my life, and a couple of yours later, what have we learned today, if anything?
That you're a massive hypocrite.
Okay, you're like 100% on the money there.
That you actually misread Persona 4's entire story because you overlooked a single minute detail.
I mean, I would like to think I gave each of these games a pretty fair shake. I enjoyed all of them significantly. Like, the lowest I would lazily rate any of these games out of 10 would be a 6, maybe, and I felt as though I was appreciative of all the work that went into these games. That you misjudged an expansive genre based on a select few bad experiences compounded by your impatience when you were a kid? Something you've learned made you miss out on some truly excellent experiences? Exactly that, actually. If I could try and create some kind of lesson out of this whole thing, it would be to provide a case for why it can't hurt to give genres, or games, or anything you aren't familiar with a second chance sometime. Provided it won't put your health at risk. If you have a peanut allergy, maybe don't push the limit there. It's probably not worth it. Variety is the spice of life, as they say, and there are a lot of different games out there. There's no guarantee you're going to find a new favorite. Sometimes you may even just reaffirm whatever biases you have against certain types of things. That's not a bad thing, so long as you communicate it respectfully. But if you give it a fair shake and it doesn't work out, it doesn't mean there's something wrong with you, and it doesn't necessarily mean there's something wrong with whatever it is. It could just be that it's just not for you. If nothing else, you tried a new thing, and you learned about yourself. That, and who knows? If you're lucky, you'll try something you never did before and come back around with a refreshing new perspective. It's certainly not the first time, and it won't be the last time that I do this. I did the exact same thing with the horror genre and ended up finding new favorites recently in the realm of both games and movies. Art is incredibly variable in what form it can take, and sometimes all it takes is that one special piece, that one special thing that makes you get it. Case in point, one franchise caught my attention so fiercely that it alone made me understand just how wrong I was, not only about these games and this genre, but how wrong I was about my own tastes. Again, I would have called you a psychopath if you went back in time to 2020 and told me that the majority of what games I would be playing for the next few years would be RPGs. Things can change, especially your tastes. I have stated in multiple of my videos that, I just don't like turn-based combat. And yet, here I am talking your ear off about all of these games despite 6 of the 9 featuring turn-based combat systems, all of which I loved. There I was telling you that I found gameplay to be paramount to my experience with the game when multiple of these games made my eyes water and had character moments or story beats that stuck with me after months and months of slowly producing this video. It didn't matter if it was a franchise I thought I gave up on or a franchise I had never touched before. I ended up loving so much of what I played. It's a testament to the quality of each of these games that months and months of back-to-back RPGs, both for this video or otherwise, the only thing I was thinking when finishing one of these games was, that was awesome, let's dive right into the next one. I still have my reservations and complaints about certain recurring mechanics or story beats in RPGs, but the bottom line is, I couldn't have been more incorrect in assessing the appeal of these games way back when. I thought for all intents and purposes that I had a fond memory of the Pokemon IP during my childhood, and then otherwise wouldn't have reason to care about this genre outside of wackier takes on it like the Mario RPGs. After returning with a series that I haven't stopped thinking about every single day since I first played it, it was clear how much more there was to see, how many other games there were to appreciate. As I said, it gave me the chance to recognize that I hadn't given the Pokemon games enough credit, and then it all spiraled out of control from there. I took a long time to make this video. That much I think I've made obnoxiously and repeatedly clear.
But I don't regret having worked on it for so long because it gave me time to think. It let me ruminate on what all of those experiences meant to me. Each game gave me something new to appreciate, different angles to look at them from, new mechanical ideas, new dynamics, new lessons, and themes I hadn't experienced prior. In just these 9 great games, I found this many hours worth of things to talk about when there are hundreds of other games out there like these 9. That I went from strictly enjoying RPGs akin to the Mario or Undertale franchises to essentially trying on every single RPG that looked interesting to me from the outset proves that there's always room to be more understanding. There are always multiple angles to look at art from, and it reminded me why I love video games so much. As luck would have it, I may just be an RPG guy after all.